Hi everyone, and welcome to the ColoSSoS Symposium. Thanks to everybody that's joining. We've got a great crowd in today, people joining us from Vietnam, Cambodia, India, the Netherlands, South Africa, the US, France, New Zealand, Canada, Singapore, and Iran, and our good friends and colleagues from Australia as well. So welcome everybody, and thank you for getting up early or staying up late to join us from elsewhere in the world. WaterRA would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners, custodians and carers of the lands and waters on which we all live, work and meet. We pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders today, and special respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders listening on the call today. Very welcome. So just to briefly show you the agenda today, I'm sure you've all seen this a fair bit, but session 1 will be focused around the sampling, session 2 around molecular methods, session 3 around data interpretation, session 4 around communication knowledge transfer, and briefly in session 5 we'll touch on the future research and innovation. We have this quick video for you today to share with you some insights into the Colossus program and to celebrate the collaboration that's happened.
It all started early back in 2020 when a research consultant of ours came to us and said he was working on a fact sheet for the water workers to understand the risk and the safety.
Water Research Australia aspires to generate the water wisdom needed to ensure healthy communities and a healthy planet. And by wisdom, we don't just mean knowledge, but knowing how, where and when to use it. And we do this by delivering collaborative water research, innovation and capability building that supports public health and safeguards the sustainability of our water resources. WaterRA started life as the CRC Water Quality and Treatment in 1995. And while in the intervening years, the breadth of our research and membership has grown and our name has changed, first to Water Quality Research Australia and now Water Research Australia, a constant has been our collaborative approach and the strength of the support we receive from the water industry.
The legacy of WaterRA was through the CRC for Water Quality and Treatment, and the membership base of WaterRA from being in that CRC really set us up to be in the right position to undertake this sort of research in Australia. It's important to understand the building on the legacy of the research that's been undertaken over the last 20 years. And WaterRA building on that with our members and bringing everybody together has been really groundbreaking.
As the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic started in January and February 2020, we wanted to think about, well, what could the water sector do to support this response, and what were the water sector's needs in relation to this pandemic. And WaterRA put together fact sheets summarising the types of problems that the water sector would face, as well as the research needs needed to be addressed. One of those research needs was to provide wastewater surveillance for the health agencies to enable them to get information on the circulation of the pandemic within the community.
WaterRA's role in driving the research behind Colossus really started in that fact sheet when we brought together the utilities, the health departments, health regulators and research organisations to understand what COVID-19 meant for the water industry. WaterRA brought together our experts to write that fact sheet, and then following on from that, it became evident that quickly it became a pandemic, and we could then start to investigate whether we could test in the sewers for the virus. So rather than add any pressure to our utilities and to our health regulators, we wanted to just utilise existing sample runs. We developed 4 expert working groups, so sampling, molecular analysis, data interpretation and integration, and communication. And this was a national collaboration of sampling experts and utilities, all of the utilities that were involved in taking the samples.
From near the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Melbourne Water began working with Water Research Australia and the entire Victorian water industry to rapidly develop and roll out a wastewater surveillance capability of unprecedented scale for the benefit of our customers and the community at large. Throughout the ColoSSoS project, Water Research Australia played a foundational role in linking up its many members, in bringing together technical experts, and in providing a bridge to international research and development.
The next step in the process after sampling is molecular analysis. The molecular analysis group, many of them have over 20 years of understanding viruses in water history.
Well, I think one of the big things with this program was that when it was set up, when we started to do monitoring for SARS-CoV-2 in wastewater, none of the technologies that were needed to do that sort of analysis had been developed yet. And what a system like this required was really a coming together of groups across public health sector, the water industry, a number of different universities, from environmental scientists to microbiologists to experts in wastewater treatment and everything in between. So it wasn't something that could be done by an individual lab. And I think one of the unique things about this program was the speed at which that was put together. And one of the key players in allowing that to happen was WaterRA, by basically integrating not just all of those different players within Victoria, but then developing nodes in each state across the country and allowing information sharing and allowing that collaboration to occur. The program couldn't have existed without that initial effort to bring people together. And well, clearly everyone across the country and around the world has been affected by this pandemic. And it's been really great for our lab and for the people within my lab to feel like we're doing something that, in whatever sort of way, it sort of contributes to helping to make the situation better. It's been really gratifying. And so I'm personally really grateful for that. It's been a fantastic opportunity. Obviously, it's a difficult situation, but at the same time, it's meant a lot to all of my team to be able to do something that we felt was making at least some form of contribution, which is really great.
At the start of the pandemic, we had very low case numbers in the state. We needed to have that external collaboration and work with the other utilities and health regulators. So it allowed us to rapidly develop our methods, make connections that we didn't already have. And the development of our methods was greatly accelerated when we had the opportunity to work with Melbourne Water and ALS. So getting those samples, access to samples that had the virus in it, because of the COVID cases in Melbourne, was very beneficial to us.
The health departments have been integral to each step of this process, which really has given it a huge impact. It showed us that we could detect the virus, and it showed the health departments how useful this could really be as a tool and have a real impact on our response to the pandemic.
It has been fabulous in being able to hit the ground very quickly, stand up methods, and have an impact, particularly in early detection in a number of different contexts that have resulted in public health action and early interventions. That includes communication to the public, as well as focused testing and being able to identify cases earlier than they would have been identified and be able to limit the size of outbreaks in a number of settings. I think the collaboration that's been created through this process has been really important in bringing together different disciplines and working together in a true interdisciplinary, not just a multidisciplinary collaboration to solve important problems. Part of that is bringing together environmental data, in this case wastewater surveillance information, together with clinical information and other epidemiological information in a way that I think is often not done, but is really the future of public health.
The health departments being integral to WaterRA membership, as well as the research organisations, really make WaterRA have a lot of impact in the industry. This project may have a lasting impact. It's been pivotal to the national COVID response plan. In future, this research, when we open our borders, it's much more likely that we'll see different variants in the environment, in the community. And really opening up this research to uncover the variants will be the next early warning. So we're really continuing to build on this innovation and the impact it's already had. I think this research will have a huge legacy for the water industry and for the combination of water and public health. I think wastewater-based epidemiology will become a huge research area and a huge area of impact for the community and for public health.
Colossus has created support and interest for the field of wastewater-based epidemiology that has huge potential to contribute to healthy communities and a healthy planet, and has positioned WaterRA and its members at the forefront of this. Colossus has established trusted relationships between leading researchers and the professionals of the water and health sectors, enabling synergy and exciting new research collaborations. And finally, it has shown the scale of what WaterRA and our members can achieve when we all work together with a common goal, and it has given us the confidence to aim high in the future.
The guidance that we got and the support that we got from our members and from the CEO of WaterRA to really develop this, putting in lots of staff in-kind time and driving it through WaterRA, it took a lot of time and it took a lot of effort, and it's really paid off because we've been able to contribute so much to the public health and to the COVID response nationally, and also to hopefully to international programs and their COVID response.
Thank you. And next up, I would like to introduce Dan, who is a project manager of the Colossus Project and director of Water Futures, to give us a quick overview of the symposium. Over to you.
Thank you. So what I want to do is give a very brief history of wastewater environmental surveillance, and then talk to a bit of a brief history of Colossus, and that then will help people understand the structure of the sessions that will follow. So very briefly, environmental surveillance in the context of managing pathogenics, microorganisms and pandemics been around for quite a long time. For example, for things like typhoid and polio, you can find detailed studies going back over 70 years dealing with using sewage and wastewater and stormwater to monitor pathogens. And even today, it's still used routinely as a method for environmental surveillance in globally. So for example, in Australia, New Zealand, place for polio as one of the arms of the global polio surveillance action plan. So that broad concept has been around for a while, although it's been less of a focus than I think it will be in the future, as Kelly just said. So in terms of the WaterRA's experience prior to SARS-CoV-2, there's been quite a bit of experience with sewage surveillance, but it's not been as widely publicized. For example, there's been quite a bit of work done. People like Joanne Hewitt, who's on the call today, and others that have looked at norovirus and adenovirus and other viruses following the genotypes that are present in wastewater to help understand the spread of different pandemic types through the community. It's also been used, for example, to understand pathogen concentrations in wastewaters, and that in turn is used to understand the treatment requirements for recycling of wastewaters. To assess risks for things like beaches and recreational water. And some of the work you'll hear about in a moment, which is a bit outside of the traditional wastewater surveillance, is looking at stormwater surveillance. And some of the techniques that were developed in stormwater surveillance have been very useful actually in sewage surveillance as well, that David McCarthy will talk about. So briefly then, the Australia-New Zealand collaboration program. It was started off, as Kelly said, sort of around Jan and Feb, largely based on what we've seen occur from previous pandemics and previous work, as well as what we've seen come out of places like the Netherlands and other places that had already published their work quite early on to show what could be done. So WaterRA put together a bit of a publication describing the concept of detecting the RNA of the virus in wastewater, looking in that for material particularly from feces, but also potentially from the swab, the material that's found in the swabs that's in the throat, because that material can also end up in wastewater from things like brushing teeth and so on. It's not just fecal matter that ends up in there. And the concept, of course, is that you're taking one sample represents a large population, whereas in a clinical sample, one sample represents a single person. So there's an efficiency, a cost efficiency in such an approach. So the project began by Kelly organising various webinars and putting out a call to members to find out who would be interested in developing a collaborative or taking part in a collaborative project, and then working crazy hours to develop a fast track process to engage people in that process, and then develop project agreements with those partners, then securing funding, and then engaging those partners. There's a lot of work in that because normal research projects, as many of you know, take 6 months to 18 months or more to start because of the standard procurement processes in research are intentionally slow with lots of peer review and stops and checks and balances. But in a pandemic, you've got to try to fast track, and that was a big challenge. And WaterRA managed to do that. The other challenge we had was that normal research processes involve a lot of tying up of intellectual property, and that would go against the time frame that we had to work in. And so we borrowed and adapted the Canadian Water Network's collaborative principles that were set up, which looked at having people focus on the user needs, in this case, the health department's needs, and also collaboratively share and openly share ideas and learnings, and not let things like prioritization of publication or intellectual property and commercialization slow down any support we could give for the pandemic. So moving away from a traditional sort of IP type model. In terms of delivery, the project began by forming technical task groups. I'll come back to those in a moment that covered specific technical areas. And then it became clear that because health services and water services are delivered at state and territory and also within New Zealand at a national level, the project had to be developed in a node-based approach with different nodes for each state and territory and for New Zealand. Then a lot of ongoing facilitation of collaboration between those nodes. From September, there was funding provided from DFAT, working with AWP and AWA to help transfer that internationally. And from this financial year, from July 2021, to develop future research. And you'll hear about all those things today. Just briefly, the task group structure, I just mentioned that because the was aligned with the Water Research Foundation's task group structure. So the sampling, testing, interpretation, and communication. And so the sessions for today will largely follow that process. So we'll go through, this session will be about sampling, then we'll cover testing, then we'll talk about interpretation, communication, and finally future research. Anything to note is for most of this period, Australia and New Zealand has had very low to no cases, and hence we're going to focus the seminars on what we've learned for low case settings, as distinct from other countries that have often had higher cases. Finally, I guess we'll get to this later on, but just briefly, there's been a huge number of partners. We're not going to be able to have all of the partners share their learnings and lessons today. It's been very difficult to choose who will speak today in such a short time. And so just apologies to the many partners that have great things to share. And luckily, though, we've got a lot of publications coming out that will share those learnings with the global research community. Now I'll hand back to Kelly, to their presenters.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for that great overview. So the rest of this session will be a series of 3 videos, which will address session 1, the sampling task group. So I'll hand over now to David's video.
Hi, I'm going to talk about sampling developments and targeting locations. So where did we start? We started in the 2nd and 3rd quarter of 2020. At the time, we had little knowledge about the sensitivity of wastewater surveillance or the best methods for sample collection and storage. Sampling development occurred against a background of relatively low prevalence of cases with occasional outbreaks and clusters. By and large, we missed the first peak of cases, at least in real time, which occurred while methods were being developed. It was generally accepted that automated 24-hour samplers, typically installed at larger wastewater treatment plants, were likely to be the gold standard. And initially, most samples were collected using these devices at the inlets to the treatment plants or they were collected at pump stations and manholes using portable auto samplers. But this approach limits flexibility, and I'll come to this later in the presentation. There are a number of challenges in developing our sampling approach. Firstly, many smaller plants don't have automatic samplers, particularly in rural areas. Grab samples can be taken, but these only represent a single point of time. A second challenge is that some of our metropolitan wastewater treatment plants serve between 500,000 and 2 million people, which greatly limits the sensitivity of wastewater surveillance. And the third challenge is, how do you collect accurate samples of wastewater from specific sites, such as food processing facilities, abattoirs, quarantine hotels, aged care facilities, apartment buildings, and so on. Basically, you need to rely on being there when potentially infected feces pass your sampling location, and you need to design your approach to maximize the chance of that occurring. So what were the next steps? So from the end of 2020, there was increasing attention on breaking down sewage catchments into smaller sizes to increase sensitivity, and on collection of samples from specific sites. Often this meant identifying manholes or inspection points in public areas and on the side of roads. There weren't enough auto samplers, and in many locations they were impractical. So, for example, they couldn't be left unmanned in public areas. That meant committing quite a deal of man-hours to the collection of samples. As a consequence, grab samples were often used. In many cases, to increase sensitivity, these were collected over extended periods. For example, every 30 minutes over a 2-hour period, or every 10 minutes over a 30-minute period. But this was not an ideal solution. So how do we meet these challenges? Well, the first challenge we needed to address was breaking down sewage systems into sub-catchments. This was an interesting exercise. Sewage systems are not designed for sampling. The aim of sewage systems is to transport fecal material from homes and buildings to treatment plants. They are not designed for wastewater surveillance. Water utilities spent large amounts of time identifying suitable manholes and pump stations to collect samples from suitably sized subcatchments. So the example I'm showing is from Adelaide, where a sewage catchment serving about 700,000 people was broken down to 13 subcatchments, averaging just over 50,000 people, which increased sensitivity over 10-fold. So you can see we've got the large 700,000 person catchment and 3 examples of subcatchments, one representing 33,000 people, one 12,500 people, and one 47,000 people. This greatly increases our chance of detecting cases if they're present. Then there were further refinements. So we still had problems with sampling. Fortunately, Dave McCarthy and his team at Monash University had developed passive samplers, and these became increasingly popular, particularly as alternatives to grab samples. And Dave's going to give a more detailed presentation later in the program. I have some examples in the photograph in the slide. You should note that passive samplers are given different names, including torpedoes and sewer subs, depending on which state you're in. These devices include a chamber that can be packed with adsorbent material, typically membranes, which attract virus particles. And the sewer subs are submerged in the sewer on the end of thin ropes and left there for a period of time. I've provided a reference that deals with the development and use of sewer subs. Initially, sewer subs were deployed for 24-hour periods, but other variations have been employed. For example, 3- and 4-day deployments so that a passive sampler is always in place at an individual site. So for example, you can deploy a sampler on a Monday, retrieve it on Thursday, and redeploy another sampler. The advantages of passive samplers are that they can be manufactured using 3D printers. They're inexpensive, lightweight, portable, and easy to deploy and transport. So what about targeting locations? Moving forward, the focus of wastewater surveillance will be flexibility and targeted sampling. In a relatively low prevalence environment, in a changing environment, the primary focus is going to be identifying unknown cases rather than monitoring trends, at least in the near future. This is going to mean changing monitoring locations to respond to different circumstances. For example, replacing monitoring of metropolitan areas with established outbreaks with enhanced monitoring in rural locations with lesser numbers of cases. And we're seeing this occurring now. Selection of locations in rural areas will be based on factors such as occurrence and proximity to cases and proximity to high-risk activities, such as large gatherings. They'll be based on traditional factors such as population size, being service centres for neighbouring communities, the presence of high Indigenous and vulnerable populations, and being on transport and travel routes. Locations may also be targeted to deal with specific risks, such as food processing plants, construction sites, abattoirs, apartment buildings, and so on. So, where are we now? We know a lot more about sewage systems than we ever did before, and probably more than we ever thought we needed to know. And some of us have learned how to use 3D printers. Sampling programs have moved on from collecting sewage at the inlets to treatment plants and pump stations using automatic samplers and grab samples to collecting samples from specific facilities and subcatchments using devices such as passive samplers. We're far more adaptable than we were. We're able to respond to changing circumstances, and there's no doubt that circumstances are going to change, particularly in Australia as we open up both our internal and external borders, and as we address the challenges of potentially living with the virus. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, I'm Greg Jackson from the Queensland Health Water Unit, and today I will be discussing the implementation of wastewater surveillance for COVID-19 in Queensland's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander run councils. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I am working, the Turrbal and Yagara people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Queensland's wastewater program for COVID-19 currently has 3 partners. My Water Unit provides policy, governance and communications for the program. The University of Queensland's Alliance for Environmental Health Sciences provides project management, logistics and research. And CSIRO Land and Water here in Brisbane has provided RT-qPCR analysis of wastewater samples, including methods development and research. We come together weekly as a technical working group to problem solve and continue development of the program. After CSIRO developed the methods for analysing COVID-19 viral particles in wastewater in the first half of 2020, Queensland's program kicked off in July 2020 and has continued expanding since then. The program is overseen by an executive steering committee chaired by the Chief Health Officer or delegate. The program now covers more than 60 wastewater treatment plants, 29 upstream or network locations, and provides information on more than 70% of the Queensland population. The program is expected to continue through to 30 June 2022. Before I continue, I need to describe some elements of our institutional framework here in Queensland. Within Queensland Health, we have 16 regional hospital and health services, or HHSs, each of which is a statutory body with its own board, and these are separate from the Department of Health where I work, but we all come together as Queensland Health. 11 of these HHSs also have their own public health unit, which is responsible for public and environmental health within their area of operations, as well as supporting those HHSs without public health units. The map to the right shows the HHSs as the colour-shaded areas. Coincidentally, there are also 16 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander councils responsible for local government service delivery, much the same as other Queensland local councils. They are shown as blue dots on the map, stretching from Cherbourg in the south up to Torres Strait Island Regional Council in the far north. The lilac dots show remote communities that have Indigenous populations which are not prescribed as Indigenous councils under the Local Government Act. For scale, it's worth noting that Marpoon, up on the west of the Cape, is 2,556 kilometres from Brisbane by road. In order to implement the wastewater surveillance program in our remote councils, early in 2021 we consulted widely within Queensland Health and also with the only other Australian jurisdiction where wastewater surveillance was happening within their Indigenous communities at that time, that is South Australia. From this, it was clear that most of these remote communities have characteristics that warrant specific consultation and engagement processes. A first draft protocol for wastewater surveillance in these remote councils was circulated for consultation to Queensland Health public health physicians and environmental health staff, as well as to the Queensland Health Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Division during the second quarter of 2021. In July 2021, Palm Island Aboriginal Shire Council became the first Indigenous local government to join the program, following some COVID-19 cases having been identified in Townsville, the city with the closest connections to Palm Island. In August-September of this year, Torres and Cape Hospital and Health Service took the draft protocol and adapted it to meet their needs, and Yarrabah and Kowanyama have now joined the program, with more communities expected to follow. I will now take you through the protocol from initiation to responses. In all circumstances to date, wastewater surveillance in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander councils has been initiated by the council itself. Following this, there will be a consultation process between the relevant HHS and the council, at which the HHS representatives discuss with council what the implications of the program might be for the community. Remote councils typically work very closely with their local disaster management group, or LDMG, which generally comprises representatives from council, police, fire and emergency services, public health, ambulance and sometimes other key community or government representatives. The HHS consultation process with councils has meant that, on one occasion so far, following this discussion, a council has decided not to proceed with wastewater surveillance, but of course they are welcome to change their position at a later date. In other cases, the logistics of getting samples to the laboratory in Brisbane will prove too difficult, or indeed expensive, for them to join the program. To take one example, our project managers received a quote of well over $1,000 per sample to deliver wastewater samples from a remote community to the Brisbane lab. We did not proceed with that option. However, we continue to seek ways to include these councils in our program. The detailed consultation stage is crucial. This is where the protocol or policy is provided to the council and the LDMG, where they can view and consider each of the possible responses to a detection of SARS-CoV-2 in their community wastewater. It's not so much about ruling in or out particular responses, but rather considering each with the HHS to understand the implications of each possible response. I won't go through each of these responses other than to say that they represent the full range of response options that could be applied following a wastewater detection anywhere else in the state, depending on the local circumstances. Although I should note that regardless of the views of the Council or the LDMG, any directions issued by the Chief Health Officer are mandatory for everyone in Queensland. Once the practicality of wastewater surveillance has been demonstrated and the Council is comfortable with the approach, we then rely on our project managers to arrange all of the logistics for the program that is delivering now around 140 samples per week to the laboratory. Most large population centres in Queensland have autosamplers at their wastewater treatment plants that are able to be programmed to collect time or flow proportional composite samples, usually over a 24-hour period. However, none of our remote communities have these samplers, and so passive samplers, also known as torpedoes, shown in the picture to the right of the slide, are preferred for remote communities. They can be deployed on a Friday and then retrieved the following Monday. They are usually deployed at the wastewater treatment plant rather than upstream, as we can then survey the entire population of the community at one time. The picture at the far right shows how they are simply dropped into the wastewater flow from an access chamber and tied off to an eye bolt. The samples are couriered to the laboratory in Brisbane in less than 24 hours. Assuming the logistics are favourable, the sample can be analysed within 24 hours of receipt by the CSIRO laboratory, with the result provided back to Council by Wednesday or Thursday at the latest. The results are then uploaded to the Queensland Health Wastewater Surveillance website the same or next day. Our webpage shows all recent detection data, but the entire program dataset is being made available on the Queensland Globe website. If there is a detection of SARS-CoV-2, the LDMG will consult with the HHS and determine the appropriate response given the circumstances in the community, as well as any relevant factors external to the community. The response to a non-detection is also considered. In most cases, sampling will just continue, but if there is a nil detect when cases are known in community, the project manager may be requested to investigate whether the sampling method is not sufficiently sensitive enough to detect viral particles from the wastewater. In this case, the project manager may need to investigate a more sensitive method, for example, twice weekly deployment of samplers rather than just once. I would just like to finish by reflecting on how wastewater surveillance is different in Queensland's remote Indigenous communities compared with mainstream locations. The similarities include the sampling and analysis methodologies used, the possibility of getting early warning of cases, which is rare in low prevalence populations such as Queensland. The range of possible responses is the same, and it is increasingly becoming apparent that, assuming methods are sufficiently sensitive, a trend of nil detects in the one location with a small population can provide some reassurance that there is no community transmission, although this is still debated by some. As to the differences, most of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander councils are remote with small populations, which brings logistical challenges. There is a lower risk of introduction of COVID-19, which has meant 0 outbreaks to date in these communities, but higher risk of rapid transmission due to strong community ties. But in the context of our wastewater surveillance program, balancing these challenges is the strong emphasis on engagement with local communities and support for local decision making. That's all I wanted to say today, but I'll be happy to answer any questions about our program at any time. Thank you.
Welcome. My name is David McCarthy from Monash University, and today I'll be presenting on some of our work on passive sampling for SARS-CoV-2 from wastewater. We call it another tool in the kit for near source tracking. I'd like to acknowledge some of my authors. There's lots here, but in particular, Christelle Shang, Nick Crosby, Monica Nolan, and Rachel Poon. I'd like to also acknowledge our funding partners, in particular the Department of Health in Victoria and Water Research Australia. It's fair to say that wastewater monitoring for SARS-CoV-2 is quite popular. Indeed, we can find some very good information about what's happening within our catchment in terms of COVID-19 infection levels. This is just some data from Melbourne. However, monitoring treatment plants, while it's important, doesn't give us very good information or resolution about what's happening within our catchment. In particular, it doesn't give us information about what potential hotspots might be occurring within our catchment and where they are. To do this, we need to go into our wastewater network. And unfortunately, most wastewater networks look like this. This is the one in Melbourne. Lots of pipes and pits everywhere. It's completely impractical to send out sampling crews to each individual pit. Indeed, it's also very hard to get good representative samples. The people presented here are taking what we call a spot sample, a 15-second grab sample that represents an entire day, potentially missing the shower or the pooping event of the 1 or 2 infected individuals that you might be interested in tracking. Sure, we could set up auto samplers in each of these pits and pipes, but we would be broke. It's completely unreasonable to expect that we'll be able to put auto samplers in each location that we'd be interested in monitoring. So what do? We need better solutions. That's why we arrived at passive sampling of SARS-CoV-2 in wastewater. So what's a passive sampler, I hear you ask? Well, it's simple. It started off with this, what we call a Morse swab. It's a piece of string tied to a piece of medical gauze, very easily available materials from your local chemist. And about 50 years ago, this gentleman started dipping these into wastewater for between 3 days and 7 days, and retrieving them, and then analyzing them for the particular organism that they were interested in. The good thing about passive samplers is that we don't miss those toilet flushes. They're continuously in the water, sampling the water for the entire day or potentially even multiple days. We tried this Morse swab, and unfortunately it clogged up. Lots of ragging quite quickly, and that meant that the mass transfer from the wastewater to the passive sampler was limited. So we tried other techniques. We made these boats to protect the gauze. We also tried other materials like Q-tips, tampons. We tried cotton buds. We also tried what we call electronegative membranes, which is what we commonly use to filter water samples in the laboratory. But unfortunately, these boats also started to clog up. We finally arrived at a bullet-shaped device, thanks to some input from a bloke called Steve at ALS Environmental. And now we arrived at a system that was able to be deployed for over a day and have very little ragging. And in this particular device that we call the torpedo, we place all of the passive sampling materials inside. So we went out to the field and we started testing these torpedoes at multiple sites around Melbourne, ranging from very small systems with just 260 people in it, all the way up to the largest wastewater treatment plant, which had 2.2 million people in it. And we compared the best practice sampling methodologies against our torpedo. I don't have time to go through all the results today, but passive samplers in general had detection on 100% of the days where wastewater concentrations were above detection levels. So great, when we're detecting it in our wastewater, we were also detecting it on our passive samplers. Moreover, which is more interesting, I think, passive samplers also detected SARS-CoV-2 in wastewater on another 50% of occasions, even when the wastewater concentrations were less than our detection limit, meaning that our passive samplers were potentially even more sensitive than our traditional monitoring method. We also took this to the laboratory and started looking at whether or not we got quantifiable results on our passive samplers, meaning if we were able to enumerate the number of SARS-CoV-2 copies on our passive samplers, were we able to back calculate what the concentrations were within our wastewater? I don't have got time to go through these results at the moment, but the answer is yes. With some level of certainty, these passive samplers are actually quantitative. These are just a couple of videos showing the production line that we now have at Monash University, making these passive samplers. We 3D print them ourselves, we assemble them, and then we also retrieve used ones and unassemble them in our laboratory and then extract RNA and assay them in our lab. We've been shipping them around the world. We've shipped them to Canada, Netherlands, USA, Luxembourg, lots of different places. And obviously we've been doing a lot within Australia itself. Got lots of ideas about the future, including making these passive samplers a bit smarter. Why just chuck them in and leave them for days? Can't we make them a little bit more active? We're also developing very low-cost auto-sampling systems. Instead of a $5,000, $10,000 auto-sampler, we're developing things that cost just $35. If you'd like to try the passive samplers, the torpedoes as we call them, then feel free. You can download them. It's all open source and open hardware. So please download them and print them yourself. Or if you'd like, we can send 30 to you for free. Already doing passive sampling? Well, why not contribute to our website, www.passivesforcovid.org. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks Dave. And we're now joined for a live Q&A by Dan, David, Greg and Dave. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, and Marlene will be joining us to host the Q&A session for session 1.
Thank you to our Dave and Greg. Some really good work.
That's from Monash University.
Some awesome work that's been going on there. So I'm just going to go through the questions. There's one that's come through from Luke Sinclair. Can I get a link to the 3D print plans, please? Dave.
Sure thing. I can put them into some type of live Q&A chat box, I think it is. And I can send a link there. Would that be helpful?
Otherwise, we can you can forward the link to us, and we can forward it to anybody that needs it. Absolutely. Thanks, Dave.
And a question from Monica. Dave, can you speak more about what you think will be the next game change in sampling innovation?
Ooh. So, Monica, I think you probably know the answer to this. I think the thing that we're working on and very hopeful for is this idea of being able to have an in-stream passive sampler that can sample at a low cost, discrete samples, and over very short periods of time, potentially, or very discrete periods of time, I should say, and allowing us to kind of, instead of take composite samples via this passive, where we're aiming to be able to take samples over set periods of time that we can trigger. We call it the MAD auto sampler discrete. And it costs $50. You can put it in your sewer, and it can take discrete samples over a period that you set out, and you can see how SARS-CoV-2 is changing over time, instead of just having a composite sample over an entire day. Thanks, Monica. Nice question.
Lovely. We'll put into health as well. I would like to hear one piece of advice that you would have for others who are just starting out on their sewage surveillance journey. One that you might field.
Yeah, I can feel this one. Patience, flexibility. Things change so quickly. So in the early days, the first few months, we're developing the method. Then we established our sampling procedures, but we're always building, we're always changing. So we started, as I said in my presentation, with automatic samplers and grab samples, and then we followed Dave McCarthy's lead and picked up passive samplers, and firstly 24 hours, then we moved to 3-day and 4-day. And we changed locations. So you change locations in response to cases. You change in response to your circumstances. So in the low setting that we have generally been in, we initially concentrated on, for us, the metropolitan area where most people live. But now we're worried about cross-border travel. So we're focusing more on regional areas. In Australia, where we're divided into states, we have to respond to detections in other states. So, for example, if there are cases in Victoria, which there currently are, then we have to increase our testing on the borders to Victoria, or on where
traffic is travelling through Victoria into our state. So it's all about flexibility.
Can I just add to that, Marlene, that I think it's really important to consult with your key stakeholders as early as possible. That doesn't just apply to small remote communities, but also to health department stakeholders, because this is new technology for many of them. And you really have to make sure that the data you're providing is meeting their needs in terms of their overall response to COVID-19. So early consultation saves having to revise your program later on.
Thank you, Greg. I was particularly interested in what about as well with regards to engaging your Indigenous communities. So that was very interesting, and I think there's a lot to learn for us in the world as well. Another question here for, I think, Dave McCarthy. You test a lot of passive samplers per week. Do you reuse them? And if so, how do you sterilize?
Good. I was just typing an answer back to, was that from Jake? Or was that, I think Jake had a similar question. That's a really good question. Actually, we don't reuse. So from an environmental perspective, we're not doing very good on the scale. And the reason why we don't recycle is because it's not. It's more cost effective to print one and make a new one. And also, we were trying to be environmentally conscious originally. And then I went up into the lab one day and I saw some of my staff there with a nail brush trying to get rid of all the poop from these passive samplers. And I said, hang on, no, stop. This is not good. I don't think this is worth the risk. So we actually dispose of the passive sampler and print a new one. That being said, I know that there are people around Australia that are reusing them and quite successfully as well. So I think South Australia reuse their passive samplers and they do it quite successfully. And so I think perhaps if you want some specifics about how to clean them, the best would probably be to reach out to the South Australian colleagues, perhaps Paul Monis or his colleagues at SA Water could give you the details about how to clean them. But we don't do it.
I can come in on that one. So we do reuse. I think we just passed more than 10 reuses of single devices. So we clean them and use high doses of chlorine, doses with chlorine with the plastics that we're currently using, or you can go to a heavier plastic and you can heat and chlorinate. But the current plastic we use high levels of chlorine, and we've tested that to ensure that the doses we use effectively destroy any viruses. So, so we're happily reusing ours.
Thanks, Team Dave. Kelly, how are we going for time?
We have a break shortly. I think we've probably got time for one last quick one, and then we'll head on into the break.
Okie dokie. Take a question from the top of my screen. So this question is from Arthur. Greg, was $1,000 the cost of samples from remote communities the main driver for not adopting a surveillance program?
Yes, it's a combination of the cost and the time it takes. They're related. The more remote a community, the more expensive it is, and the longer it takes to get the sample to the laboratory. So we explore every opportunity to reduce the costs, but ultimately we have to make sure that our program is sustainable, and so therefore sometimes cost does come into the decision as to whether we go ahead or not.
Thanks to our wonderful session one panelists. Back to you, Kelly.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Dan, David, Greg, and Dave for a wonderful first session. We'll now head into a break, and thanks to everybody who's writing in the Q&A chat. Do join the next session and continue to make it as interactive as possible. Thanks very much, and we'll see you after the break. Hi everyone, and welcome back to session 2 of the ColoSSoS Symposium, focusing on molecular methods. We have had a couple of technical issues around the bandwidth that we've tried to improve the quality for you. And just to note that the videos being played in this symposium will be available in high definition after the symposium as well, so feel free to go back and have a look. So first I'd like to hand over to Paul Monis to kick us off with his video.
Hi, my name is Paul, and I'm going to be talking to you today about our experiences of developing methods during the pandemic. Now, my presentation is a little bit different to what is in the session guide, because I figured that we know what we need to do to get sensitive detection. We need to optimize our methods for virus detection by having optimal concentration, optimal RNA extraction, things like that. And also we need to know what we need to do for PCR assays. We need to minimize inhibition, good assay design, things like that. Really what I thought I'd talk about is more the challenges that we had and how we might overcome those in pandemic times. So the first thing I thought I'd talk about is why did we develop a test in the first place? One of the reasons is that we had a high likelihood of success in our opinion. So we already knew that WBE has been used to test other viruses such as polio. There have been prior reports in literature during the original SARS outbreak of detection of SARS virus in both feces and in the sewage of hospitals with SARS patients. We also, early during the pandemic, early reports of SARS-CoV-2 in sewage coming out of the Netherlands. And to help us along, there was rapid publication of methods that concentrate and detect SARS-CoV-2 or other related viruses in sewage samples. So all of those things made us think that there was a good chance of success with the method, as well as our own experience with wastewater as well. So on that topic, we had also core expertise at SA Water. So we're very experienced with developing molecular methods for detecting pathogens, so both in assay design and in assay optimization. We had people that were highly technical proficient at doing molecular analysis and experienced handling environmental or wastewater samples. And that included for analysis for enteric pathogens, both viruses and protozoans. Within SA Water, we also had extensive knowledge of the sewage network and also of sampling, and that was in the form of our trade waste team. So they knew the networks very well, and were well versed in the safety requirements for sampling from the network. We also had people who could help us with site selection when we came to selecting sites to break down our networks. The last, but maybe not the least of importance, is that we were also experienced with quality systems and NASA testing. So we knew the requirements to develop a robust assay that could be validated and would withstand scrutiny for accreditation, although we haven't gone for accreditation as such. Another thing that we had is we had a very strong partnership with SA Health. So really, the benefit of the wastewater testing for SARS-CoV-2 is not for us, it's actually for how it might be used to manage the pandemic response. So we had a pre-existing relationship for water and wastewater quality testing and also incident management to protect public health. So that was a close relationship with SA Health. And we also had co-investment and collaboration to develop the sampling and test methods for SARS-CoV-2, as well as the protocols for how we interpret the results. And we had this relationship, I suppose, before the ColoSSoS project, but it also helps for us to share those experiences through ColoSSoS as well. In terms of key challenges, there were many through the pandemic. So firstly, we had pandemic conditions. So there was the supply chain. It was difficult to procure equipment. It wasn't possible to buy composite samplers. Maybe some of the other utilities out there cornered the market on those, and also overseas. Initially, it was difficult to get the sufficient control material to just get the molecular tests running or to actually do the entire test method itself to validate the performance or optimize it. Even the reagents, the materials, including concentration, extraction, and detection, were very hard to get hold of. So we had to really make do with what we could get and be flexible to be able to change as either we can get hold of better materials or protocols, or as other people reported improvements. We had to not be overly invested in what we've developed and be willing to change if something better came along. There was competition for funding. So at the start, as when Colossus was being developed, there was really the option to either collaborate through something like Colossus, or there were some teams out there that were really after maybe self-advancement or self-promotion. So they had their own agenda of what they wanted to achieve. And then that created competition either for funding or for reagents, made it a bit more harder. We had other things as well, such as split shifts and workplace restrictions, even staffing limitations. So it was difficult for staff movement, and things like split shifts made it very difficult to get some of the validation work done as well. Initially, there was very limited information about things like virus shedding persistence, things that we needed to understand to know what we had to target for, what virus concentrations might be present in the wastewater, which would inform the types of methods that we needed to use to detect the virus. There was also limited information about how we might go about interpreting the results and action in the health area. And there was also limited information. There may have been reports of successful detection, but that didn't tell us how the methods performed. And it wasn't until a little bit later that we started seeing some of the more useful papers coming out when they were comparing things like virus recovery rates. Although in those cases it wasn't with SARS, it was with other viruses. The last challenge there was gaining acceptance from clinicians and clinical labs. So while we had a good relationship with our regulator in terms of water and wastewater compliance, we didn't have any recognised expertise or trust or credentials recognised by people in clinical testing or clinicians. There was also some limited understanding that we had to overcome among clinicians in terms of their understanding of differences between environmental and clinical samples. And in some cases, there was maybe misunderstanding of how PCR assays perform differently to other analysis, such as ELISAs. How do we overcome those? Well, one of the things that helped us overcome in terms of collaboration was the establishment of Colossus. It was quite important for that, and it allowed us to have state health authorities in those and all the various approaches from different researchers about accessing samples. We could point them at Colossus, and that had been the mechanism by which we were collaborating for COVID testing in wastewater. It also gave us that rapid network, that network for sharing ideas rapidly, and also for troubleshooting as well. And that allowed us to reduce duplication of effort and waste of resources. And similarly, that allowed us to accelerate method development by distributing workload. So different nodes shared information, we didn't repeat the same thing. And we also could share samples as well. And that was very important in a low case setting where we had very limited positive samples. We had access to some highly positive samples coming from our partners that were undergoing their second wave of COVID. We also, another thing to overcome some of those issues was having adaptive research. So we had to accelerate quite greatly the development of methods of something that might take us a year. Under normal conditions, we had to cram that into months. So we had to be very methodical and minimalistic to conserve reagents. We had to, as I mentioned, plan for supply chain problems and have contingencies. Be very clear about the criteria we're going to use to assess method performance and stick to those I've mentioned here and there. We have to be a bit ruthless about how we replicated our experiments. We had to rapidly assess and throw out performing methods and focus on those that were promising. And I think probably the thing that held us invested was using real samples as the test bed for method comparison and for training. And once we thought we had a good method, it was very important to have robust controls in QC so that we could fine-tune the methods as we went. So we got them to be fit for purpose, and then from there, QC was critical. Probably one of the most important things in getting acceptance was the training and communication. So the technical proficiency was a key driver for method performance. Having appropriate training meant we could have very consistent results between operators. We had very clear communication across our own teams to identify problems and share and document improvements, and also with other people in other nodes. And that last thing there is that we share information with the clinical folk to build trust. And I don't have time to go over this in detail, but we did some education pieces around explaining to clinicians and clinical labs the differences between clinical samples and wastewater samples. We also then talked about the challenges about wastewater samples in terms of detection and variable preference, things like that. And we even did a bit of a little mini schematic of why virus numbers can be quite variable and how PCRs or replicates within a PCR or between PCRs could give different results. We sort of illustrated to them how that happened. And the last thing I'd like to finish on is just acknowledgements there, which I'll leave up on the slide. Thank you for your attention. My name's
Hello, today we'll be talking about our whole genome sequencing of SARS-CoV-2 and wastewater at PAP West. The prevalence of COVID-19 in WA has been low, with the maximum daily cases peaking around 30 in the initial outbreak. Widespread restrictions were put in place quickly, and this paired with geographical factors has created a considerable buffer to the introduction of undetected COVID-19 in the state. The clinical testing program in WA is pretty standard. We have clinical PCR on RA and nasopharyngeal response for diagnosis, and all positives then proceed to whole genome sequencing, meaning that we have this repository of genome sequencing from clinical cases to access. We also have a community-wide surveillance program in wastewater. Recently, we've been submitting our wastewater RNA to the whole genome sequencing lab, and multiple occasions we've had successful sequencing producing greater than 90% genome coverage and sufficient depth for analysis. Unfortunately, today we only have time to talk about two of these situations, and these were in our hotel quarantine catchment. And what we saw here was CT values stronger than ever historically preserved, despite very low active case numbers. And the primary thing we wanted to determine, was there any unknown clinical cases within these catchments at the time? For the bioinformatics related to the wastewater, the first thing we did was we requested a list of active cases from the Department of Health. And this isn't just active cases currently residing in the hotel quarantine, but also cases that have recently been cleared for hotel quarantine and happen to have residential addresses within the hotel quarantine catchment. And what we do firstly is map the wastewater sequence to a reference sequence and determine the number of mutations that the wastewater sequence actually has. And then by mapping that to the patient sequences, we determine how many of the wastewater mutations are accounted for by the same mutations present in an active case's clinical genome sequence. So here we have a wastewater genome sequence at positions that do not map to the Wuhan reference sequence. On the right-hand side, we have our known clinical cases and their mutations present at the same locations. A green box indicates the mutation matches to the wastewater, red box indicating the mutation does not match to the wastewater, and the white box is indicating that the nucleotide present there is the same as in the Wuhan reference sequence. What we're seeing in patient 3 is that all 30 of the mutations present in the patient's genome were also present in the wastewater sequence, indicating that this patient was excreting into the wastewater at time of collection. The remaining patients had anywhere between 4 and 8 nucleotides matching the wastewater sequence, and that means we can't rule out partial contribution of these patients. However, it is unlikely, as the areas that map to the Wuhan reference sequence weren't found in any of the wastewater reads. Here we're just simplifying the data to the number of mutations in patient sequences that match the wastewater mutations. And what we found is that there are no unaccounted mutations in the wastewater genome sequence, with evidence implying that the likelihood of there being an undetected case in the catchment being low. The second sample was collected on the 29th of June, which coincided with the lockdown of the Perth metro area due to community transmission in the northern suburbs. Wastewater detection did occur in the 2 northern suburb treatment plants, as well as in our hotel quarantine catchment, where we saw stronger than usual CT values. However, there were no known community transmission cases residing within this catchment at the time. So we mapped the wastewater consensus sequence from this sample to the clinical consensus sequences of the northern suburbs cluster. And what we found was that there were no mutations exclusively present in the northern suburbs cluster present in the wastewater sequence. And when we mapped this wastewater consensus sequence to the known active cases in the hotel quarantine at the time, we found the majority of the wastewater SNPs matched to 2 patients in the hotel quarantine that were family members, with 30 out of 31 found in patient 2. However, there was a single nucleotide polymorphism that was unaccounted for. This polymorphism was an ambiguous polymorphism, being found in over 6% of the wastewater reads. And we've done a further investigation and looked for the presence of the SNP in all international sequences submitted to GISAID, and we found that it wasn't present in any, suggesting that this polymorphism was likely the result of a sequencing artifact. So here we're describing the ability to get near-complete SARS-CoV-2 genomes from the wastewater when only a single or a pair of cases are contributing. The ability to identify these individual contributors is only really possible in catchments that are free from widespread COVID-19, and there is significant genome diversity between the active cases. We also need to have all the genome sequences from the known cases available for comparison. Contributing factors to spectral sequence is currently unknown. We think maybe temperature is related, as these occurred during winter, and also maybe the time of collection of the wastewater, as each sample correlated with a recent patient diagnosis with a strong signal. There may also be some lineage-specific factors, as we've only had successful sequencing with the 318 and Delta variants. Thank you for your time, and I hope you guys have a good day.
"2020 was a crazy year that none of us will forget, though this year hasn't been a whole lot better. But it wasn't all negative, and the exponential rate of learning, the increased capacity for high-throughput testing, and the new skills in online meetings and workshops will remain with us going forward. Even my mum has heard of PCR testing, though don't ask her how to explain it. The pandemic has also established wastewater epidemiology as a respectable and potentially fundable area of research. Wastewater surveillance for SARS-CoV-2 started as a concept in early 2020 and rapidly grew into a familiar and essential source of data for the state and territory health departments to use to manage the pandemic. The speed with which this capability grew was critical, and now, in the pandemic workshops designed to capture what was learned and what could have been done better, speed is a common theme. With the support from the ColoSSoS Project, I don't think the wastewater surveillance capability in Australia could have developed any quicker. Multiple labs developed their methods based on prior experience and knowledge, and a range of variations evolved in the measurement approach. There's nothing wrong with labs using different methods, and in this context it could be seen as a positive outcome. However, this variation naturally leads to the question of whether some methods perform better than others, and the easiest way to find that out is through an interlab study. The NMI was contacted in July 2020 to run the interlab study for a number of reasons. We are not performing wastewater surveillance, so we're considered independent in this context. We're part of the federal government, so we're not biased towards any testing labs. We hold accreditation for running proficiency testing, though this study was outside of the scope as it's a new measure aim. The matrix is significant. Multiple labs within the NMI hold accreditation for ISO 17025 for routine testing, so we're very familiar with the quality requirements. And lastly, we produced a SARS-CoV-2 calibrate from it using an activated virus applied to us by Vitrol that could be used in the study. I specifically didn't call the study a proficiency test, and I didn't want to scare off potential participants. Several analysts had only just got their methods up and running, so weren't confident in their performance. Others had no prior experience with participating in proficiency. So a typical proficiency may include assigned consensus values, Z-scores, and measurement uncertainty. Instead, this was a collaboration in which every lab would hopefully gain some useful information, with all the data being de-identified, no labs were named or shamed. Due to a combination of factors going in our favour, Australia had a lull in the pandemic at the start of 2021 that coincided with the inter-laboratory study materials going out. It's actually weird in hindsight to think I was worried I'd missed the boat with the study, but the pandemic was over and there would be no more wastewater surveillance. Well, clearly I got that wrong. The study material consisted of 10 aliquots of domestic Sydney wastewater confirmed to be negative for SARS-CoV-2, and even that would be more challenging to acquire if I was running the study today. 2 aliquots of inactivated virus were provided to be spiked into the wastewater when the participants were ready to start, plus 3 sets of the NMI calibrant material consisting of a dilution series of inactivated virus quantified using RT digital PCR. Finally, an Excel spreadsheet was provided to capture the raw data, which meant all lab results were interpreted in exactly the same way. Reaction efficiencies were calculated from the calibrant data and used to convert the sample CT values into copy number concentration of SARS-CoV-2 genomic equivalents, which were the units used to measure the calibrant. The concentration factors for each protocol were also calculated, allowing recoveries to be reported per mil of starting wastewater. The participants were asked to prepare spiked samples and replicates, following very specific instructions, but to analyse the samples using the routine testing protocol I had developed during the previous year. I designed the study to tease out as many sources of variation from the different steps of the protocol without being too onerous, as I was aware the participants were very busy people. The study captured efficiency of the RT-qPCR reactions based on calibrant data, the assay choice, and also the reproducibility of assays when more than one was used, virus recovery method and its reproducibility, effects of storage at 4 degrees of virus recovery, RNA purity, which was measured by assessing levels of inhibition, and finally, the recovery yields per mil of wastewater. A typical proficiency test would not elaborate on all of these details, and it would not have taken as long to interpret and document the results either. And my goal was to provide as much information back to the participants as possible. I'm not going to go through any of the results today, though, as the full report is now available on the WaterRA website. The study report has provided multiple benefits, some expected and some unexpected. The individual labs were able to assess the performance of their own protocols compared to their peers and make changes if necessary, with some labs already performed outstandingly. The health regulators were able to gain greater confidence in the quality and reproducibility of the data they were receiving. This was particularly critical where case numbers were very low, as any new detects needed to be responded to immediately. But there's a huge cost in getting it wrong, both financially and from a public confidence perspective too, as their compliance is critical when following lockdown rules are getting tested. As an example, despite their initial lack of confidence, the New Zealand lab performed really well in the study. And when I hear Jacinta Ardern talk about their detects in the New Zealand wastewater, it makes me feel very proud of that lab. I can now say their performance matches the best labs in Australia, based entirely on the results of the inter-laboratory study. So where to going forward? In an ideal world, testing labs would already have ISO 17025 accreditation for these methods prior to reporting any samples. There was nothing ideal about last year. Instead, labs participating in method development were initially selected based on their experience in both routine testing and specifically in virus recovery from wastewater. The NMI can run future inter-laboratory studies that would look more like a proficiency test now that the methods are more established. However, a proficiency test only goes so far in demonstrating a lab's ongoing competence to produce accurate and reproducible results. In the real world of routine testing, water quality varies, storage times, temperatures vary, and sampling strategies are modified. There is also staff training, equipment calibration, and so on. These variables cannot be captured in a proficiency test. Instead, the effects of these variables are assessed as well as they can possibly be during method validation and managed through the use of quality controls run in parallel with every routine sample and effective staff training. Quality accreditation captures the collective steps in place that achieve ongoing competence. significantly decreasing the risk of incorrect results being reported. Proficiency is only one tool in the toolbox. Although you clearly don't need to be NITRA accredited to achieve excellent results, quality accreditation also provides a transparent and universal system for demonstrating the lab's capability. Currently, all labs performing clinical testing for SARS-CoV-2 are accredited against ISO 15189 for medical laboratories, and this is compulsory if you want to claim costs against Medicare. When I was first approached by Dan Deere to consider an interlaboratory study, one comment that kept coming up was the challenge to compete with medical research groups for funding because the wastewater work wasn't taken seriously. Well, clearly that's changed based on how much political and media coverage this work has received. There are still those in the medical fields that will judge a lab's performance based on accreditation achievements. I suspect going forward, once labs have had a chance to take a breather, gaining quality accreditation for this wastewater surveillance will be of significant value in levelling the playing field, and staff at NITRA are willing to help. This work is already being discussed at the federal government health level, and I'm not sure if medical researchers will be happy to make room for new players competing for the same pools of money. But hopefully, funding for wastewater epidemiology will become available in its own right, now that the benefits have been so clearly demonstrated. The NMI can run future proficiency tests if the water industry wants this. We can also hear your wish lists so that the proficiencies can be designed to add the greatest value. And we hope to continue working with this industry to provide whatever support we can offer. So thank you for your time and also for the opportunity to this.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for presenting at that session, and welcome to the live Q&A. And just a reminder to put your questions in the chat.
Thank you. Our first question comes from James Merritt for Jake. Jake, how do you manage to get near complete genome WGS sequence coverage with such low viral loads in wastewater samples? Can you share details of the WGS methods that you use and the sequence platform?
Thanks for the question. I just preface this with saying that the method that we use for wastewater whole genome sequencing wasn't optimized for wastewater. The method was validated for clinical samples, and I guess we got fortunate in that we submitted wastewater extract and it worked. We use an Illumina platform with the Illumina Nextera library prep kit for cDNA synthesis. We use a silo for superscript, and yeah, so synthesize the cDNA. Then we do the tiled amplicons with the Arctic V2 primers. One thing to note is we normally, when we process a wastewater sample, we will process it in replicates. So we'll have anywhere between 2 to 4 replicates, and this really does increase the likelihood of getting a whole genome. So we'll combine all the few files from the 4 replicates into a single BAM file, and then create a consensus from that. So that's one of the reasons why we probably have higher coverage than maybe laboratories that try a single replicate. And yeah, and the sequencing is performed on an Illumina iSeq as well. We have been looking at doing nanopore for it. But yeah, we have a publication that's been submitted, and there'll be more details of the exact methodology in there.
Looking forward to it, Jake. Thank you. James, a question. Please continue to keep putting your questions in the chat window. And we've got one from an anonymous attendee. How can we use WGS to identify variants that are circulating in the population, especially in more complex samples containing multiple variants?
Yeah, that's a very good question and something we've been looking at quite extensively. But the important thing from the bioinformatician has said is that we can't just be looking at mutations that are present in 100% of the reads. We do need to look for these ambiguous sequences that are present in a fraction of the reads, which we do. And it's going to be, when you have a mixed sample with all these mixed mutations at the same site, it will take quite extensive bioinformatics work to figure out what are the likely mutations present. In the high case setting where this is possible, we haven't really had any experience to do this yet, but something I guess we're looking forward to trying.
stuff. Question from Monica. Jake, are you able to speak to WA health plans for the use of variant monitoring at ports of entry, like planes, ports, HQ or other? What is the current sampling program?
At points of entry, we don't test planes or ports yet, but I guess the current plan is if we have a detection that we deem strong enough at any of our wastewater treatment plants, this will be submitted for whole genome sequencing. And we also do have commercial real-time PCRs that detects specific mutations within the genome. I guess the ones that are specific to Delta variant and stuff like that.
Thanks, Jake. We've got a lot of questions coming in for Jake. Maybe we'll ask Kate a question. Kate, in terms of, I guess, private organisations who may be interested in, proficiency testing for themselves or understanding what their current limitations are, what do you think the scope is for that sort of work at the moment?
Well, there's been a few queries and interests in running another proficiency, and we're already running a mini proficiency for one client. So I think, well, I kind of suspect we will be running a new one. And I think it would be nice to open it up to a broader range of people. So maybe not just the WaterRA members, but others as well. Because I guess the first one, we weren't really sure if it was going to work, if the materials were going to be appropriate. So I was, I guess it was good to keep it into a closed sort of family group of WaterRA Colossus team. But it would, to actually advertise, to have it made more broadly available would be good. And if we do a second one, it would be good to obviously change it up a bit and make it a bit more up to date. So it's possible we can get access to variants, so inactivated virus variants from Vidril, and also maybe considering including some synthetic reverse transcribed RNAs that include other variants of interest that get added to the PCR plate, just again to add more value in terms of what people can learn about their own protocols.
Thanks, Kate. There's a question here from Warish Ahmed for Jake. How many sequences need to be present in 100 ml sample to get a positive detection? Process limit of detection estimation after loss through concentration and RNA extraction.
If this is regarding the qPCR detection, we have done work with gamma irradiated virus and RNA to determine this limit, and we think our limits of detection is around 25 copies per reaction of our, I guess, final our PCR. So that's 5 microliters of RNA into the reaction tube. So, but yeah, we think 25 genome copies is our detection limit for the full process.
Thanks, Jake. And what are the typical CT values of samples you submit for whole genome sequencing? Of the samples you submit, what proportion do you get the sequence back on?
So the general rule, which is quite an ambiguous rule at PathWest, is that any sample that has a single replicate below a CT value of 36 in any assay gets submitted to whole genome sequencing. So that is what we do. If one of the replicates is less than 36, we will submit that. And when we have a CT value less than 36, I'd say almost, maybe 95% of the time, we'll get near complete genomes from that in a clinical sample. When we get above that 36 mark and hover around the detection limit, that's when we start to see, I guess, sporadic detections, and it's really just a case of probability whether we get a genome or not.
Thank you, Jake. And I was going to ask Paul a question, but another one's just come in for you, Jake. Sorry if I missed this in your talk, but how did you obtain the WGS data from the clinical samples for your comparisons?
So at PathWest, we're both an environmental and clinical laboratory. We do 100% of the whole genome sequencing for WA. So we have all the clinical sample whole genome sequences readily available, and we just contact the Department of Health for a list of the active cases, whether that's active cases in the hotel quarantine or ones that have recently been cleared and reside within that catchment.
Thanks very much. Paul, I was wondering if you could share with us some of your experiences in terms of, starting up the testing and the analysis program. What are some of your lessons learned for those who might be looking to do the same work?
It just started coming through then.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep.
That's right. It wasn't on mute, so maybe there's some lag or something. I was just saying that probably the most important lesson was that it's actually easier to trial different methods or train people using real samples that have a reasonable amount of virus in it. We had the gamma irradiated SARS at the start, but I think given that it's a mixture of probably intact virus and RNA, we thought we were having problems with methods because we were getting low recovery at the start, but really, I mean, it was an advantage. It drove us to optimize a method that would get high RNA recovery, but it was a bit disheartening at the start because it took a fair bit to get it working well. It held us in good stead though, because when we got the real samples, we found those much more easier than the spike samples we were preparing. So I think as a lesson, there's no substitute for the real stuff to get experience with.
Cheers. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I think I'll throw it back to you, Kelly.
Thank you, and thanks again to all of our great presenters, Paul, Kate and Jake, and thanks for all the great work that you've done over the last 18 months and more. It's not easy, but it makes a big difference. So thanks very much, and thanks everybody for asking your questions in the Q&A. And we have a short break now, and we'll be back at 2:20. Welcome back to session 3 and the important task of data integration and interpretation. We'll hear from Departments of Health in New South Wales and Victoria, Australia. So starting with Zena's video from New South Wales Health.
So my name is Zena Bradford-Hartke. I work with the Water Unit for New South Wales Health. And today I'm talking about the New South Wales Sewage Surveillance Program for SARS-CoV-2. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, and also any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be participating in this webinar. So I'm currently recording this from Wangal land of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters in which you all work today. Given it's quite a short presentation, I thought we'd focus on the current context. So the current outbreak in New South Wales is the Delta variant. It started in mid-June of 2021 and it started in the eastern parts of Sydney. So you can see the detections in sewage, and it quite rapidly moved to other parts of Sydney. So the west and the southwest were the initial areas. We could see the detections in sewage changing, and often we would get detections prior to clinical cases. And this is now spread across all of Sydney and also outside of Sydney. In the end of July is when we had one of the first detections outside of Sydney for this current outbreak. So Armidale is an area in the Hunter, New England up there. It's quite far away from Sydney. So there were obviously known cases in Sydney, but this was new and of concern. So in Armidale, there were some recovering cases that were known, but they were older cases, and given that we hadn't had a detection in sewage prior and no recent cases in the catchment, media was put out to alert the community and to ask for increased testing in the area. Subsequently, over a week later, we did actually find further cases in the catchment. So this is just one of the examples where we've had detections prior to clinical cases. There are a number more, such as Dubbo, for example. This is a more recent snapshot, and you can see now that we've got detections outside of Sydney in many areas. We often have had detections in sewage prior to clinical cases, but obviously not always. And what you can also see is there are still a large number of sites where we haven't had detections and we haven't got clinical cases. So the current focus is really on these regional areas and looking to provide early warning of potential cases in those areas. So that's over 170 sites in regional areas at the moment, and we're working with 85 different utilities outside Sydney, and that covers 91 different local government areas. So there's a large number of stakeholders involved, and ultimately we've got coverage of about 90% or more of the New South Wales population through the sewage surveillance program. One of the other aspects I wanted to highlight is the sampling near borders. So this program is a state-based program, but we do obviously interact with our neighbouring jurisdictions. So this arrow here is Mungandai, which is a town in New South Wales, but very close to the Queensland border. And the hospital that people access is actually on the Queensland side of the border. So there's movement across that border, and Queensland Health were quite interested to set up sewage sampling for that town. So we've included that as part of the New South Wales program, and the council is in New South Wales. They collect the sewage samples, but then results are shared with Queensland Health so they could respond if we did have a detection in that area. Similarly, where we get detections in these areas near the Queensland border, we'd notify Queensland Health so that they could respond. And we have similar arrangements in place with South Australia and Victoria along those borders. One of the other key aspects that I wanted to highlight is the interpretation of the results. So in order to do this, this was a piece of work looking at the integration of the clinical cases and the sewage results. And we focused on the early data from Sydney, looking at March to July of 2020. So you can see here, this is the Sydney sewage catchment areas. Some of them are quite large, and also the catchment doesn't align to people's postcode or LGA. So in order to do this, it was looking at GIS to put people in the correct catchment, and then also looking at hotel quarantine data because we had cases in hotel quarantine. So to make sure that they were attributed to the correct catchment, and also looking at hospitalisation in case that was in a separate catchment that people might have been moved to. And for this work, we focused on the initial period, so the first 9 days from -2 to +7 of onset. We analysed the data in a few different ways. I think this is probably one of the simplest ways, and what it shows is as you get more cases in the catchment, then the probability of getting a detection in sewage also increases. And that makes sense. You can see there's a threshold here of about 10. So once we get above 10 cases per 100,000 in the catchment, then we get a greater than 50% probability of getting a detection. So this is great, but one of the key things to remember is that we were using some of the early data from the Sydney catchments, and some of these catchments are quite large, so they can be in excess of 1 million people. And while we've normalised the number of cases here to cases per 100,000, these cases could be anywhere in that catchment. So anecdotally, what we're seeing in some of the smaller catchments are much more reliable detection in sewage. One of the other things we looked at is the odds of getting a detection in sewage and how that varied with cases in the catchment. So you can see overall it was statistically significant, and we're more likely to get a detection in those catchments that do have cases. And if we break that down further, you can see if there's less than one case per 100,000, then that's not statistically significant. But when we have more than one or more than 10 cases per 100,000, then it is statistically significant. The other things we looked at were the sensitivity and specificity. And again, that varied with the number of cases, but overall the specificity was quite high. And the key takeaways from this really are that if we do get a detection in sewage in the absence of cases, then that should prompt action. But a non-detect from the sewage doesn't mean that there are no cases in that catchment. In terms of how we use the information, there's a few things I just wanted to highlight. First of all, we work to actually identify the priority sites around the state to target sampling because we can't actually sample everywhere. And we were looking at obviously major populations, but also, for example, borders and holiday towns. And in the Sydney area, we really worked to break down those larger networks with Sydney Water so that we could actually sample a much smaller area, and that would allow for a more targeted response if we did get a detection. In terms of the response to detections, if we have known cases in that area, then a detection in sewage provides consistency. But if we have a detection in sewage and there are no known cases, then this would typically prompt a media alert to encourage further testing of the community in that area. So even with increased testing, we don't always identify cases. And again, it can be people that are just visiting to the area, but the increased community testing still provides some information and some evidence that we don't have ongoing community transmission in that area. So it's still a valuable piece of information. The other key thing is obviously the maps that we've produced to share information with the community. They've been very, very helpful. And the final thing really, this program has changed over time and it will probably change again. So we have to adapt it based on the context and also the public health response. So this is an adaptive program. A lot of the information is available on the New South Wales Health website. So you can see the results there, they're updated daily, and also media alerts and the weekly report. So if you're interested, please have a look. Before we finish, I'd like to thank all of our partners. I don't expect you to be able to read all of those. There's a huge list, but especially Sydney Water and UNSW, the serology and virology laboratories at New South Wales Health Pathology, all of our local health districts and Water Research Australia, and obviously all of our utilities who are participating in the program. So a huge thank you to everyone involved. It wouldn't be possible without the commitment and dedication of all of our partners. So thank you. And I'll leave it there.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Monica Nolan from the Victorian Department of Health and the Wastewater Surveillance Program. I'm going to be presenting today on the Adaptive Wastewater Surveillance Program in Victoria, and really emphasising how we've been able to adapt in what is an ever-changing context, and emphasising the public health use and impact. And I would really like to thank the Colossus group and Water Research Australia for the opportunity to present today. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to be just speaking about how flexible wastewater surveillance is as a tool, speaking to our changing context and really illustrating with case studies, adaptive use cases, considering geographic-based surveillance, as well as really localised surveillance at the facility level for both vulnerable communities and in accelerated transmission settings. Looking ahead. So I think as you all appreciate, wastewater testing is really an extremely flexible tool. Wastewater sampling is obviously at a population or a geographic level, and it allows us to test for individuals with COVID that may be asymptomatic or prior to their symptoms developing. And it's not then person dependent in terms of symptomatic testing, which requires a person to then seek out testing with the uptake of that testing as well as turnaround time. It's also an incredibly flexible tool if we think about scale. So anywhere where there is wastewater, which is anywhere there is people, we're able to really sample, and whether that's at the large city scale level of millions of people, down to suburbs or towns, or even down to the building or the facility level. So as we think about the wastewater sampling options, we can consider aspects of space, time in terms of the frequency and duration of sampling, and also the people frequenting that space, whether they live, work or visit there. The other aspect of wastewater testing being an extremely flexible tool is in terms of the flexibility provided in being able to switch on and off sites, to change the frequency of sampling, the duration of sampling with passive samples, allowing a sample to be taken from a few minutes to a number of days, as well as the different sample type adapted to the situation. And then it also allows very rapid turnaround. Most of our samples are processed same day for any urgent samples, or next day routinely. The context is obviously really evolving quite quickly, with the dominant features being the change in variants and the arrival of Delta through the year and the impact globally, as well as the changing horizon of increasing vaccine availability and also vaccines are recommended for all of our different cohorts, including our young people. In Victoria, the context has been dominated by the Victorian large second wave between July and September. Is shown on this graph with the number of cases illustrated per day in Victoria, and then to the far right, the more recent situation where cases have increased, and we've had to pivot away from being able to achieve zero community transmission to really focusing on vaccine coverage and looking to manage our healthcare burden on our healthcare system. But there's been a number of other features as well along the way, as shown in the call-outs, with smaller outbreaks that have been able to be controlled, whether that was a small hotel quarantine incursion back in February, to the outbreaks that we had with Kappa and then the first Delta outbreak, which was successfully contained in June, July, and also large regional outbreaks, including in Shepparton, that were all able to be contained. So in all of these changing contexts, really wastewater surveillance, as shown in blue, has had a contributory response. So if I can do a quick thought experiment with you, if you imagine that we hadn't been able to contain, say, the Kappa and first Delta outbreaks in July, and the trajectory was similar to what the recent trajectory would have been, we would have been spectacularly in a different situation, with 2 months less jabs in arms, thousands of people infected, our health system overwhelmed, preventable deaths and sickness, and a risk to the rest of Australia. I just put this forward to remind you of thinking about it. It is hard to measure success in what was prevented, because it's what didn't happen, but really thinking about what we've been able to contribute to with wastewater and prevention is really along these lines. I want you to keep that in mind. So as we turn now to geographic role of wastewater surveillance and how we've been able to use early detection in that setting, our purpose has really been to provide early detection of undiagnosed cases, to provide that early warning and initiate action. And that action is really about enabling public health action in terms of provision of effective communication and engagement with the community, and also ensuring that testing services are available. But it's also about then providing that information to empower individual behaviour change, so that people in communities where there's a wastewater detection can know that and can adopt themselves COVID-safe behaviours more consistently, and also reach out and take up testing if they're symptomatic, and ultimately that can contribute to limiting transmission and containing an outbreak. So this slide is illustrating our response in regional areas early on in the program. So if you recall, our program started in August 2020, which was the back of the most significant second wave that we had. So Melbourne was really awash with virus. So we turned our attention for early warning to the regional areas. And you can see this map displays all of the areas that we had active sampling at that time, including the results. So a tick means that wastewater results were negative, and the little viral star indicates a positive result. So you can see that we had very wide coverage across the state, and indeed we were able to cover all population centres that were more than around 10,000. We were also able to continue to adapt through the period of a number of months to changing risk. So that might include static risks, for example, where abattoirs or significant trucking or transport routes were, as well as dynamic risks. So thinking about seasonal changes such as summer holidays or alpine resorts during the winter, fruit picking season and harvesting in some of the regional areas, to large events such as cycling races. And then also other dynamic risks such as emerging outbreaks and being able to pivot and turn on sites and increase the frequency of sampling there. And fast forwarding to just 2 months ago, this shows our results in the middle of August, and it shows 2 regional towns that had wastewater detections at that time, one expected with known cases in the area, and Shepparton shown in red with unexpected detection with no known cases in the area. The rest of Victoria, though, where we continued to have very extensive sampling, had no positive results. So what happened in Shepparton? So the results there actually were an important early warning. We had a number of repeat detections with the first positive sample taken on the 10th and the 11th of August. And after reporting on the 12th, there was communication from the Department of Health out to the people of Shepparton to please, if you live or work in these areas, get tested. Our colleagues in Goulburn Valley Health, the Public Health Unit, stood up additional testing services and engaged with the community through social media. And testing uptake was able to be increased. And a week later, the first of many, sadly, COVID cases were recorded in Shepparton. So that early warning allowed some significant preparation and communication to the public. Once the outbreak had started, though, we needed to turn our attention and adapt to consider what is our adjunctive or additional response to the outbreak response. So one of the things that we did was think about early detection and how could we further contribute. So we expanded surveillance to some nearby smaller towns that were not usually part of our surveillance but had connections to Shepparton. And we also were able to break down the Shepparton subcatchment, city of 35,000 or so, into smaller areas. So we could also call out any localised areas as an early warning and have call-outs for testing for the communities there. We were also able to recognise that there might be some localised settings that were more vulnerable to incursion with a higher number of community members that might be infected without knowing it. So we also were able to stand up very quickly surveillance at 9 large, so all of the large residential aged care centres as well as 2 high-risk industry sites. There was also another outbreak with a staff being infected staff member at a large aged care centre in a nearby town, and we were also able to stand up post-exposure surveillance. So we provided wastewater surveillance through 14 days after the staff visited the facility as an adjunct to the rest of the public health response. Happily, all of those results were negative, and that was reassuring. Turning back to regional areas again, this slide now shows 2 months after the previous slide. Again, you'll see on the map that orange is calling out expected detections and red unexpected detections where there are no known cases. So in contrast to the map of 2 months ago where there were only 2 locations in the whole state with positive wastewater detections, we now have wastewater detections right across the state, sadly, and most of them are now expected. But we have been able to, over the period of the last few weeks, have wastewater detections and have that call out to the public. You can see on the lower left-hand corner, there's a little box that indicates early warnings and calling out the particular locations, Halls Gap, Robinvale, Portland, etc., where we were able to call out to the public, there's wastewater detections in your area, please get tested if symptomatic, and later there were then cases that were able to be found. You'll also see that there's a little inset here, which is called out as Bendigo, and I'll speak to that on the next slide. So here that same inset is shown, and you can see that Bendigo is, for example, a large town of more than 85,000 people. And once we had wastewater detections at that level, we were then able to further break down the wastewater treatment plant into subcatchments, and then continue to sample of those smaller subcatchments and provide early warning in those areas. Here showing 4 or 5 areas in red where there was wastewater detections with no known cases. That was able to be called out to the public, encouraging people to test, and indeed cases were then found in those areas. So turning now to localised surveillance, this is then looking at sampling at a facility level, for example, and thinking about vulnerable communities such as within residential aged care or high-rise social housing. And here our primary purpose is really to prevent sickness and death, prevent accelerated transmission in those settings, as well as to protect and promote human rights, balancing that with the promotion of health outcomes. So in the setting of high-rise social housing, the context is really that these are quite complex settings with a high risk of incursion and accelerated transmission. And there's also significant community distrust following prior lockdowns that happened during the second wave, with significant restrictions on those communities and significant distrust of the authorities. So the program that we stood up was really proactive surveillance to cover all of the metro high-rise social housing, given the context of community transmission in nearby areas with connections to those communities. And we were able to stand up surveillance in 60 high-rise buildings across 17 estates in Metro Melbourne, sampling more than 1,120 samples, of which 20% tested positive, and with great turnaround time, with 41% achieving same-day results. We also established very strong partnerships with other parts of the Department of Health, the Department of Family, Fairness and Housing, and service partners on the ground and also the community. And through this partnership, we were really able to offer very proactive engagement and testing, and offering also alternative accommodation to any of the tower residents that were diagnosed with COVID. And they were able to then relocate away from the building, and then we were able to continue also with wastewater surveillance with that early detection value proposition. So here, this is the case study, and I'd like to share one of the first high-rise social housing that we did samples in. And in fact, the very first sample is shown at the top there on the 12th of August, was a positive sample. We had same-day results immediately, very strong detection. The next day we had further strong detections. So we were able to provide that information to the Department of Family, Fairness and Housing. They leapt into action. There was communication to all of the residents with a call to test if symptomatic. And indeed, 2 residents tested that same day when they received that message, and were diagnosed the next day and were able to be relocated to hotel quarantine. And fast forward, and through continued wastewater detections, continued follow-up and testing in the household contacts and the buildings, we were actually able to identify a total of 7 cases during this period, all of which were able to be successfully relocated and to limit the outbreak once they were relocated. We were very pleased to see negative wastewater detections, no wastewater detections, negative results. And then later, a few weeks later, we were actually again having a similar cycle where we got further wastewater detections, again initiating the same cycle, and 4 further cases were able to be diagnosed. So in total, in that one building, we were able to identify 11 cases, and who knows how many upstream cases that then prevented. So now turning to high-risk industry surveillance, here our purpose has really been to prevent accelerated transmission, protect the supply chain and critical infrastructure, keep workplaces safe, and protect pathology and the individual testing capacity for higher priority needs. So as part of our high-risk industry surveillance in our second wave, we actually mandated 25% of workers in these industries to be tested each week, which was a significant burden on our testing capacity, and really had poor acceptability amongst workers for obvious reasons. So in September 2021, we mandated employers from specified industries to adopt this new surveillance approach based on wastewater surveillance. On the right-hand side, you can see that includes high-risk industries such as meat, poultry and seafood processing, supermarket and perishable food distribution centres, food supply-related warehousing and construction, with different worker thresholds. And basically, it's a combined testing model that includes wastewater surveillance and then escalation to individual testing based on wastewater detections and the frequency of those detections. And that really helps target our PCR testing and reserve capacity in that system for symptomatic testing and higher priority testing. And it also aims to minimise workplace disruption and maximise business continuity. So this is a case study from a high-risk industry site with a mixed distribution centre with a workforce of 400 to 500 per day, and they were also having rapid antigen testing in place as well. So we had an area level detection in the area in which the facility was situated. So that triggered then facility level sampling. And soon after, we had our initial wastewater detection that resulted in what we call the first test escalation with a recommendation to the employer. The testing is recommended for all workers. That employer was very then proactive and initiated the testing. We then had a further wastewater detection the next day and communicated that to the employer and indicated that testing was now required. The employer had already proactively initiated that. And shortly thereafter, 2 asymptomatic workers were identified through that process. So the story is not finished. Then we had further detections in the overall facility-wide sampling point, but we also had a detection in the sub-facility sampling location. And that led the employer to then retest in a focused way the group of workers from that worked in that area. And then 2 further asymptomatic workers were able to be identified with no business closure. So in closing, the key learnings that I really want to highlight is adapt, adapt, adapt. Riding that COVID bronco, we need to be incredibly flexible. I think we need to make sure that we have very clear objectives in the different use case settings and consider what is the immediate public health relevance and action. Partnership with so many different actors is critical. This is a work of many hands and requires coordination and each player playing their role. Flexibility is a given. Innovation has also been a feature of the program, and I really want to call out the development of a number of things, particularly the passive sampling that really has expanded the use case for wastewater surveillance. And finally, effective communication. I think that all of our program is about finding a signal that's relevant, but if we're not able to effectively communicate that to the effector or the person that needs to take action, whether that's a public health unit, an individual or a community, we're not quite there. And I think that may be the weak link that we need to work on further. So I just want to close with thanking and acknowledging the many, many hands that have contributed to this body of work, and then particularly the Colossus collaboration for their partnership and inspiration. So thank you very much. My contact details are here, and I just want to close with a call out: adapt, adapt, adapt. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Monica and Zena. Those are great presentations, and thank you, Zena, for a great overview of what's currently being done now. And wow, Monica, all of those case studies, and I love that message of adapt, adapt, adapt at the end. Is very relevant. So over to Marlene, who I think has some questions for you both.
Definitely, very strong, clear message there. Question is from Arthur. Zena, you mentioned some variability in WBE results dependent on case numbers per population. Interested per population in what type of sampling was performed, auto-samplers, passive sampling, or combination?
Sure. So for the actual analysis we presented, that data was the early sewage treatment plant catchments in Sydney. So they're all auto-samplers. But our program is a combination of different sampling methods. So some of the regional sites do have auto samplers, but not all. So for those, they're doing often a composite grab. So they'll do spaced out during the morning peak flow. They'll collect usually 2 samples and then combine them, or the lab will combine them to get a composite during that morning peak flow. And then we are also looking to move into the passives for another option for where we don't have the auto samplers. But that initial piece of work was with the 24-hour composites.
Thanks, Sina. Question for Monica. I think yours is a great example of a success story in wastewater-based epidemiology, and you highlighted all the undesirable things that didn't happen. What were some of the challenges in engaging those who were unfamiliar with the benefits of wastewater monitoring? Would you have any advice for others going through this program at the moment? In addition to all the good points you've read.
Thanks, Marlene. I think one of the challenges is clearly, in Victoria and New South Wales can probably relate to this more than any other jurisdictions. When things get busy, everyone gets busy. So it's really actually very difficult to get sort of bandwidth of individuals, whether that's the contact tracing team that are really focusing on that area and really trying to say, we've got some relevant information here. So, you know, that piece of integration, I think really requires persistence. I think that, you know, in our program, we kept knocking on the door and saying, you know, we feel that this has value. And as we were able to then start to showcase, well, actually in Shepparton, in Epping, in so many different settings, wastewater was the early warning. I would say I think that the very senior leadership in terms of our chief health officer and people at the very senior level actually saw the strategic value quite quickly and were, you know, early adopters and champions. But I think in the operational response, it really was quite challenging just in terms of bandwidth and trying to work out how we can work effectively and make these systems work. So I think it really is about persistence, being able to really put forward what is the value, how does this relate to public health action, and over time there was more and more people, I think, that had literacy around it. But as it was very fast paced, we kept having to continue to demonstrate what the value is. And now where we are with a shift from the low case context to a much higher case context, there's a whole new conversation to have about, well, what's the wastewater surveillance relevance in this new era as well.
Thank you. A question's just popped right up. Do you need animal ethics for using rats?
I'll throw that one to you, Zena.
We're not using rat. I'm guessing that's referring to the rapid antigen test. That's not an actual animal.
Okay, the next question is from Brent. With wet close testing, do you have any data or thoughts on likely distribution of frequency of workers in different settings and therefore likelihood of picking up cases?
Yes, thanks, Brent. I think this goes back to, you know, sort of a fundamental question about what is wastewater surveillance picking up, and it's, you know, it's not just poo. So really thinking about, you know, what does it mean in terms of when you have an infectious case with high viral load, shedding of hands in washing hands, you know, discarding tissues and those sort of things. And I think that probably Dan Deere might have some comments about this in terms of, you know, some of the data coming out of the US. We certainly, I think generally there's an understanding that most people do number 2 at home, and there's a pattern. It's not something that's usually done in the workplace or school or other locations. We certainly are able to pick up wastewater detections, including at a very high level in facility settings. We haven't gone back and had a stool diary or been able to really, you know, pin that down. But I certainly think that it would be interesting to have that information, but I certainly think what we're picking up in the wastewater is beyond just stool and related to defecation habits. But again, washing hands, you know, the other kinds of viral fragments that can come from an infectious person into the sewage system.
Thank you. A related question for Zena. You mentioned that a non-detect doesn't necessarily mean there are no cases. Do you have any advice on what a non-detect could mean or why we get a non-detect?
Yeah, obviously there's a range of factors that contribute to that, and also it depends on your sampling method. So particularly, depending on the time of sampling, you may miss a relevant event. And it also depends on mixing and catchments and dilution and inhibition and things like that. So there's a range of things that can result in getting a non-detect. And so it's more looking at a trend rather than an individual result. So we look more in a catchment over time and see how that's changing rather than relying on a single result to say whether or not we think there would be cases there.
Monica, a question from Joe. Did 11 cases in one high-rise social housing building. Can you comment on issues in privacy and stigma associated with this level of granularity of detection, as well as communication required?
Yeah, sure, Joe. I think that's a really, really important question, and I think there's a whole conversation around, health and human rights and how they get balanced in all sorts of ways, particularly in Victoria's high-rise social housing. All of the localised surveillance, whether that's industry or high-rise social housing or aged care or any other sort of localised setting, is not published on our externally facing website. We only publish geographic level data on the website. So the information only goes with particular addresses and locations in relationship to the social housing towers back to key stakeholders, being the Department of Family, Fairness and Housing and the community groups working to provide services. And that information is then provided back to the residents. So it's really empowering the residents to know what's happening in their building. And there's been quite a lot of appreciation and feedback from community forums about how valuable they actually found that information and how they actually felt cared for, that there was a focus to be able to say what's happening so that they could actually take action. It's something we certainly want to look at further. The other feedback that was very interesting was that feedback from, I was speaking to the Director of Family, Fairness and Housing yesterday, involved just in terms of the wastewater detections and early identification of cases really resulted in no lockdowns, a minimization of any restrictions on the residents. So it was actually, certainly a benefit in that way. But we pay a lot of attention to privacy, and when we have much more localized information, really attention to who are the stakeholders that appropriately should have access to that information.
Thank you, Monica. There's another anonymous question that's come in. The Victorian program is clearly best practice, but not all countries will have the resources that Victoria has. Are there simpler programs that would be still provide value for money in less developed contexts?
I think that the key question, and what I was trying to raise in the presentation, is really to consider that wastewater testing is an incredibly flexible tool, and you need to be very clear as to what are you seeking to achieve that has immediate public health impact. And I think that question is valid in any setting. So if you're looking at a low case context, you've only got limited resources for individual testing, which is much more expensive than wastewater testing. Really to be thinking about, well, how could we target and use wastewater testing in a way that's going to be valuable and help directing our resources, and thinking about particularly areas where there are particularly vulnerable populations, where an early warning and limiting spread in those settings would be very valuable, or accelerated transmission, which if that gets out of control, could really lead to a significant outbreak in much more resources. So really thinking carefully about where is an ounce of prevention, using wastewater and using early warning worth the pound of cure, and an effective use of resources.
Thank you very much, Monica and Zena. I think that was all the questions, Kelly. I'll throw it back to you.
Great, thank you. And thanks very much again, Monica and Zena, for your presentations today and for all your hard work and amazing advocacy and efforts over the last 2 years nearly now. And You know, the whole program wouldn't be what it is without the health departments owning it and taking it forward. So we really appreciate everything you do, and we look forward to continuing the journey with you guys. Now we'll take a bit of a break, and we'll see you in the next session. Hello everyone, and welcome back to session 4, Communication and Knowledge Transfer session. We're going to be hearing from the Department of Health in Victoria, Sydney Water, South Australia Water, and the Australian Water Association. So I'll hand over now to Rachel Thigo.
Good afternoon, my name is Rachel Poon from the Department of Health in Victoria, and today I'll be talking about communicating wastewater surveillance. The objectives of the Victorian Wastewater Surveillance Program are to provide early warning and early case detection, to motivate individual behaviour change, to go and get tested if symptomatic, and this is really to limit transmission and to prevent and contain outbreaks. The wastewater surveillance process flow includes 4 key steps: sample collection and transport, sample analysis and confirmation, results interpretation, and also the communication of results. The first 3 steps of this process have largely been optimised with the support from our water utility and sampling colleagues, as well as our laboratory partners, to ensure that results are reported to us with the minimum turnaround time. The results are interpreted with known case and case location data to determine if they're expected or unexpected detections. All results from our wastewater treatment plant and geographic catchments are communicated on our public-facing website, and any unexpected wastewater detections are called out from these particular locations in media. We also follow up unexpected detections with our water utility and sampling colleagues, and also advise our public health units and facility level stakeholders to ensure that they're aware of the results so they can take subsequent public health action. Our public-facing communication and subsequent call to action is done through daily press conferences and media releases. We also use social media to post about unexpected wastewater detections, and really to advise anyone who's visited a particular catchment over a period of time to go and get tested if they're symptomatic. Further information is also available on our wastewater testing website, where there's the background information and Q&As about the program, and we also update daily, Monday to Friday, and on Saturdays if there's any unexpected results reported on a Saturday, our latest detections. So this may include expected detections, non-detects, as well as unexpected detections. Looking back at the evolving response and how we've been communicating wastewater surveillance, we introduced the concept back in September of 2020 to highlight what wastewater surveillance is, and also what to do if there's an unexpected wastewater detection in a particular area. So this was during the second wave, throughout the period of the extended lockdown. Communicating wastewater surveillance results in the low case setting between the second wave and the current outbreak. We focused on media releases and also social media posts. We generally had really good feedback and engagement through social media. These are 3 examples, and this example in February of this year for a particular call out of an unexpected detection had our highest ever number of comments and shares, with 7,500 comments and over 3,000 shares. In the current high caseload setting, we are focusing our efforts on localised surveillance and the targeted communications to support this body of work. We do need to do specific engagement and build on existing and also new relationships. We're working closely with other areas. For example, for social housing, we've been working with the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing to ensure that the messages are reaching the target demographic. This includes translating audio and sending simplified text messages to residents when communicating unexpected wastewater detections, and also working through industry-specific guidance to support wastewater surveillance in industry settings, whereby it might be in the construction industry or cold chain. So this includes significant engagement and then also reporting. how effective is our communications approach, and have our communications resulted in the desired behaviour change? How can we better explain wastewater surveillance to motivate behaviour change? We're seeing comments through social media and also survey results where the call out of unexpected detections isn't necessarily going to change people's behaviours to go and get tested if they're symptomatic. So we need to think through how can we try and change our approach to target the at-risk audience. So on next, we need to evaluate our communications approach, including an update of our wastewater surveillance website. We can also think through how we better communicate the wastewater surveillance program in general. We've got a number of case studies and success stories, particularly around early warning and the call out of unexpected wastewater detections, and really highlight the adaptive nature of the wastewater surveillance program, the benefits and the use case in the different caseload settings, and particularly in an increasingly vaccinated population. We've also been working with our digital media team to produce a series of videos to meet some of the people that have been supporting the wastewater surveillance program. This includes Steve, our sampler, and Christelle and Nijo from the analysis labs, as well as Monica from our wastewater surveillance program. Lastly, I want to thank you all for your time. Here are our contact details if you want to get in touch with us, and also to acknowledge our water utility partners, research and laboratory partners, and also the many, many people at the Department of Health who have helped support this program.
Hello, I'm Catherine Cunningham, and I'm here from Sydney Water Laboratory Services to present optimising, operationalising and fast-tracking the COVID-19 laboratory research into the New South Wales Sewage Surveillance Monitoring Program in collaboration with New South Wales Health and supported by WaterRA. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we live, work and learn, and pay respect to elders past and present. I'm presenting today from Gundungurra and Darug country, home of the Three Sisters in the Blue Mountains. I've started the presentation with the timeline that shows the rapid shift from research through to the operationalisation of the program from the original 50 to soon 350 samples per week. In March 2020, Sooty Payapat successfully extracted the virus from sewage samples using PCR technique. By May 2020, New South Wales Health was showing signs that they would be able to use it to help manage the pandemic. This moved quickly to routine sampling and collection from Sydney's 25 wastewater treatment plants, then inclusion of regional New South Wales, and finally expanding Sydney into its smaller sewer network. Recently, the ratio of Sydney network and regional samples was being adjusted each week to meet outbreaks when Delta hit, and the current program was no longer expansive enough to meet all the participant needs, and so weekly sample targets have been increased again. This figure indicates the key stakeholders in the program and who has a direct link to which group based on their technical skill and the important information they're sharing. Starting at the centre, we have Sydney Water Laboratories, dealing with both the New South Wales Health Water Unit, comprising Katrina and Zena, and you'll hear from Zena shortly, and Sydney Water Principal Advisor to Public Health, Kay Power. The next most important stakeholders to join were key sewer network and mapping specialists, Sean Kenny and Tiffany Chan. Then as the program grew, we needed digital support for automated reporting. New regional participants joined the program from across the state, and media and comms teams played important roles for both organisations. Starting with the initial work at Sydney Water, specifically Sooty Payapat and the Cell and Molecular Biology Lab have extensive experience developing methods to detect pathogens in wastewater. It was Sooty's foresight as the pandemic unfolded to collect archived wastewater samples back to October 2019, and with fresh samples from routine weekly compliance runs to build the baseline he needed to begin the research. Many hours of hard work and networking with international suppliers and researchers saw him single-handedly successfully develop what became the highest quality method in Australia to detect genetic markers of SARS-CoV-2 in wastewater. And other states moved to adopt part of this methodology for their program through Colossus. With Sydney Water being well equipped to deliver ongoing monitoring, but working at an unprecedented rapid pace, we had to map out our NADA framework, what onboarding and training in this new method looked like. This is using a basic Gantt chart tool in Excel, and it helped us come up with some very specific dates that we were able to provide New South Wales Health, that we could meet particular targets for weekly sample processing. This was very important to build trust with management, chief medical officers and ministers that we were delivering what we said we could by when, without the risk of false positive or negative results. We had to be very careful with our messaging to avoid quality mistakes, staff burnout, but also risk not meeting the public health need. Sydney Water has been investing in culture through the Blue Bus Revolution. This was pivotal to create effective connection between specialists. It's more about leaving rank, authority and ego out and bringing all voices in. It becomes a safe place to ask stupid questions, safe space for excellent failures, and know they aren't going to be repeated. This project was able to tap into many staff skills. Each of them knew what they brought to the project and that they were respected. They were also included in communication and feedback loops, so they knew in real time if their piece was helping or hindering, which allowed them to change tack if needed. It created magic very quickly, and that has stayed throughout the research and the operational phases, but it's also the bit that's hardest to maintain longer term. I believe our investment in culture was one of the reasons this program succeeded. Basically what I learned in real life, which is one of the founding principles of Blue Bus, is that high culture outperforms strategy. This is Wollongong. It's one of Sydney Water's 25 wastewater treatment plants. It's sampled at the inlet pipe every 6 days for our EPL compliance. This program provides clear means to get access to samples for little extra spend at the beginning of the program, and this led to the vital research component in the initial method development phase. Early on in the program, there's also a lot of information being communicated from many directions, and staff were confused. Sydney Water had to move quickly to provide reassurance in the form of fact sheets, webinars, published papers, Q&A sessions, which were subsequently stored on our intranet. Review of staff PPE found we already had appropriate measures in place to minimise risk and protect them from infection. An early issue arose when field staff who had attended the South Coast where the Ruby Princess was quarantining were alarmed when they realised they might have been exposed and somewhat angry that they were not told in advance. So you can have all the information to make them feel safe, but it won't necessarily work unless you bring them into the conversation, listen and provide answers to their questions. So we were able to resolve that fairly quickly and we didn't experience issues like that again. In contrast, the positive news releases had a real motivator effect on the staff and helped connect them to the high purpose and why we were involved in the work. They were also very proud to be a colleague of Sudhi's, and he loved talking about it with them. On the mapping side, Tiffany, our mapping specialist, was urgently called in to provide maps of the sewer catchment boundaries. This was going to be extremely important for the public health announcements, helping identify what areas may be associated with the positive detection. Sydney Water has a large area of operation for over 5 million customers, from the Blue Mountains to Brooklyn to Gerringong on the South Coast. But when we looked at the coverage of those treatment plants, we had a big variation in the estimated populations that fed into them. You can see a big difference between Brooklyn with less than 1,000 people to Malabar with about 2 million. So the usefulness of the testing was challenged in these big sewer catchments, and the team had to work quickly on the next stage. And that was to take the bigger catchments and break them down, like Malabar here, and find new sites to be able to narrow down areas into smaller population groups. We'd never worked collectively in a space like this before. Sydney Water's main aim was to keep sewage in the pipes and get it to the downstream treatment plant. We were now routinely opening it up and setting these sites up for safe, ongoing sampling. So this is what our smaller catchment sites look like. We had our network and mapping specialists rapidly gather information to help us identify sites that could be accessed safely. We have pipes that are gravity fed and flow downhill, pipes that are pumped upstream by sewage pumping stations, rising mains, manholes in public parks, in the middle of roadways and in national parks, and they all vary in depth, which we had to limit to between 2 to 11 metres due to the suction limit of the mobile auto samplers. So here's a field mobile unit in action, getting an aliquot every half an hour for 4 hours, ideally representative of the peak morning flow from 6 to 10 a.m. This was unique to the New South Wales Sydney program compared to a single or duplicate grab sample. We also had to leverage the skills of digital specialist Jishi's Eye to assist with the rapid generation of auto reports that were inclusive and accurate. If results were generated late into the evening, making sure they appeared on the daily 7 a.m. report was crucial to New South Wales Health. Our systems at the time had a cut-off at 6 p.m. for overnight upload to databases. We had to tailor a workaround, and I'm proud to say that that is still in place today. As the program has grown, so too has the report. It features samples scheduled for collection, those received and at the lab, and the finalised samples with authorised results. This was important to New South Wales Health to be able to manage community and government expectations with accurate information. Alerts of any positive detections were also instantly emailed to key stakeholders. And interestingly, we also had to run new confidentiality training sessions with field, laboratory, and digital business staff, as they were all seeing results before New South Wales Health and any public announcements. So it was extremely important that our company was not responsible for any contract breaches and potentially leaking information before official announcements. So at the same time, we also had to ramp up to meet the needs of regional New South Wales. What started as reactive work in areas with outbreaks has now become statewide expansion of our routine ongoing monitoring. Logistically, it needs a lot of support. So extra staff were hired to support the communication, compilation of public health unit kits with correct equipment, and documented instructions to assist with correct sampling. Different areas had different needs, so this needs to be tailored and managed accordingly. Tracking of couriers was also a big piece of work. At the same time people are placed into lockdown, online shopping and delivery increases, and that can have a major impact on the timely delivery of samples. We had a lot of early learnings through compromised samples that were delivered but could not be processed, and we had to use those fails to learn fast and do things better. This required very close coordination with New South Wales Health. They continue to manage all aspects of the prioritisation, service and communication to all participants, and it's important not to deviate, especially during a pandemic, as this could have all sorts of ramifications. So how do we keep track of things? Through organised documentation. And this is the now 70-page monitoring program for New South Wales Health, covering the treatment plant inlet sampling, the smaller sewer network sampling, and the details of the regional program. And it's about to go back into draft because we're beginning a new pilot, which will run in parallel to the existing program to hopefully help us find some field sampling efficiencies. That consists of passive samplers being deployed for 24 hours to replace grab sampling from regional participants and possibly replace the 4-hour auto sample in our network, pending results which are looking promising. This has required the rapid onboarding of a new supplier to keep up with the 3D printed cartridges used in the deployment, and our staff have again provided instruction material for New South Wales Health to help guarantee a successful program. That concludes this presentation. I'd like to end on one last note. I was at a NATA technical audit recently and was challenged by a co-technical assessor who indicated this work really belonged in the representative state health departments. And I was able to politely challenge for all the good reasons that I see came out of this collaboration with New South Wales Health, and how, when managed effectively, can give you a very agile and robust program. Thanks for your time.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be talking about SA Water's experience with knowledge sharing, method transfer and laboratory training throughout COVID-19. So as with everybody, the initial phase was really rapid phase. We started in April of 2020 to start developing our method. And by June 2020 had established that method. But what we've done is worked through continuous improvement throughout the piece for the last 18 months to ensure that we're getting the best out of our samples that we can. In terms of knowledge sharing, so we did have pre-existing long-term relationships with a range of different laboratories around Australia and also internationally, and health departments as well. We had early engagement with those laboratories who we knew were trying to set up COVID testing as well to try and fast track our method in terms of finding out what was working and what wasn't in different laboratories, and then enabling us to go and apply those techniques. The formal engagement came through the Colossus program, and this brought together a much broader group of researchers, health departments, scientists, the whole gamut, into the mix to enable that knowledge sharing to occur. And this happened through weekly meetings where that the expanded membership all came together across all the states to discuss what was going on and support each other depending on what was needed. So what was shared? We had a whole range of information shared. It might have been test protocols, a new paper had come out, what test kits were working, what test kits weren't working, all this sort of information of how to and what to do, and any new updates that people had. In terms of method transfer, so we started with sampling methods, and it was important to us that sampling methods were safe, and especially for our remote communities. We test 6 of our remote communities, wastewater treatment systems on a weekly basis, and we wanted to ensure that the samplers out there were collecting the samples correctly and safely. We've also been training up our council wastewater treatment plants. Not all of our treatment plants are run by SA Water, many aren't. So we started with that. We then went to test protocols, and this was to help support our interstate laboratories, or even within the state, intrastate laboratory, to do some of the COVID testing. So this involved provision of protocols that were working for us, and any other information that was needed. We also helped them with in-house training and troubleshooting of any results and issues that came up, to ensure that we were getting the best out of those samples and the test methods. It also enabled transfer of new improvements to methods for early adoption. So rather than reinventing the wheel, it enabled a much faster reaction to new improvements, especially important in pandemic times. We've also provided ongoing support to these different laboratories as well. What we have done, this hasn't all been one-sided, it's also given us a great deal back as well. So an example of this is taking on the sewer submarines from Monash Uni. So we now fully deploy sewer submarines across Metro Adelaide and around the state on a weekly basis. So that's been a terrific improvement for our method processing and the amount of time that my technicians spend in the lab processing those samples. We offer methods around liquid samples and also passive samplers, different types of methods that are established across Australia now and across the world. But we've been providing these to different laboratories, different RNA extraction kits that we've tried out, what works and what doesn't, and then also the detection kits as well. In terms of laboratory training, we have done in-house staff training and external laboratory training, so coming into our laboratories and trying these things out, and then taking them back to their own labs and supporting that way. This isn't always possible, especially in the current times, so online training's been important as well. And so the protocols have been developed and then informed and discussed through different types of media. We've also supplied positive control materials, which has been really important. Some of our states didn't at the time have positive samples to test from, so they couldn't actually start their testing. So we provided some of those positive samples interstate. We also evaluate those methods side by side, so to ensure that the laboratory is actually achieving really good detection and the equivalent of what we're getting in our laboratory. And we're also part of the NMI trial. More recently, we've been involved in the Mekong project through AWA and Department of Foreign Affairs and Trading, and this is Paul and Melody. So a series of workshops and also documentation around the different types of methods that we have up and running, and then online forums to enable discussion of the methods to show how to use them and what to do for those types of methods. Finally, acknowledgements. It's a big team who's worked really hard to establish all of this work. So thank you to all of them, and thank you everybody online. Bye.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming along. I'm very happy to share with you how we assist Mekong countries in responding and recovering from COVID-19 with knowledge and tools harnessed from collaboration on sewage surveillance of SARS-CoV-2 in Australia. The Australian Water Association is the biggest water association in Australia. We connect Australian and international water sectors and professionals. We share knowledge and technology innovation from Australia to international partners. We inspire a sustainable water futures and profile the Australian water sector's contribution to the SDGs. COVID-19 surveillance in Mekong countries is a program which is a part of Partnership for Recovery to enable Mekong countries to develop a cost-effective early warning system for detecting SARS-CoV-2 in wastewater by sharing best practices on sampling and testing SARS-CoV-2 in sewage and wastewater in Australia to Mekong countries, and sharing tools to integrate data from this project with data from clinical testing to assist governments to determine the prevalence of COVID-19 in the community. The expected outcome are to transfer methods for environment surveillance for SARS-CoV-2, which is being used in Australia. This method can work as an early warning and tracking system with lower cost to detect the prevalence of COVID-19 in the community, thereby reduce health and economic impacts in the region. And this program also aims to support our Mekong countries to enhance their capabilities in rolling out environment surveillance for SARS-CoV-2 and help their governments returning faster to new normal. To implement this program, we have established a community of practice in Mekong countries with the formation of partnerships between Australia and Mekong countries, including sampling partners working on tailoring the sampling, storage, and transporting wastewater sample to the lab. We have partnership with laboratories working on sharing and tailoring the analytical protocols, and help partners to share experience on surveillance priorities and coordinate with other control mechanisms. Depending on the interest from each country, we have different approaches to support Mekong partners in building their capability. For example, in Vietnam, their interest is to tailoring methods and piloting wastewater testing in Haiphong. This province hosts the largest international shipping port and several quarantine facilities. In Thailand, their interest is to tailor methods for potential application in key tourism and urban areas. And in Cambodia, their need is to tailor method for testing wastewater from Phnom Penh and other hotspot locations. Some outcomes and lessons learned so far are water operators and staff are essential workers. So their works must continue to maintain the continuity of water and wastewater services, the most important part of a preventive health system. Water sector is at the front line and learning very fast to maintain operations and help the central government responding and recovering from the pandemic. Coordinating multiple ministry, utility labs, and agencies in Mekong countries has been not an easy task. Tailoring and transporting knowledge for transfer is very important to make sure it suits different demands from big countries. Pivoting to digital knowledge sharing platform is necessary, even though trade-offs are available compared to face-to-face communication. Last but not least, the transfer methods provide a platform not only for current situation of COVID-19 pandemic, but also for future crises with emerging virus and even good method for surveillance of drug use. Our program is now still in progress, and we will continue support pilot of COVID surveillance in Mekong countries and support the development of frameworks, roadmap for scaling up at national scales. And here are our team members at International Industry Forums, IWA. If you have any question, you are welcome to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Hoy, and thanks to Rachel, Catherine, and Alex as well. And we're also joined here today by Sally, who's part of the Sally Hoy team of AWA. So welcome, Sally, and please put your questions in the chat, and Marlene will have some questions for you all.
Thank you. That was an awesome couple of presentations. So thanks, guys. I'm going to throw to Luke Sinclair. We had a question that snuck in just as the last session was closing, Luke. So we will get to that question as well when we can. But your question for this session, how did you avoid excessive ragging around composite sampler hoses in a high environment? Ours were almost ripped away from the machines due to the weight of ragging on the sample lines. So this one might be for Kathy or Alex. Alex, you're on mute.
There we go, found the right button, apologies. So we didn't have any issues with ragging. We were using passive samplers in there with the sacrificial bottle at the head of them. So we didn't actually see any of that. The only time we've had a couple of passive samplers broken, and that's through, we think, when they were inserted, that they sort of bounced around and hit some of the wall. So we've not seen that at all.
Rachel, did you want to speak to the Victorian experience?
Around ragging of passive
Yes.
samplers?
Yep.
I guess I don't think we've had too much of an issue around the ragging with the modified designs and looking at mainly inlets of wastewater treatment plants. I know we've had issues with other problems like fat balls and fat deposits at some of our wastewater treatment plants with significant industrial waste. But in terms of ragging, we haven't actually had too much of that as an issue so far that I'm aware of anyway. Dave might be able to provide a bit more comment. We've had some issues around some of the deep wet wells and passive snapping off, but yeah, there's been some modifications in designs to address that problem as well.
I just saw another bit of the question, Marlene, and that was around the failure of the ropes. So we have our trade waste team were watching those quite avidly to see how quickly they would degrade, and we're now on a 3-month replacement program. So they check them all the time, but 3 months is generally when they start to fail, so they're replacing those early.
Thanks, guys. And Paul Monis, thank you that you've responded in the chat as well. So Luke, if you had any further questions on that, we'd be happy to put you in touch with the appropriate people. So a question for Catherine. You've highlighted the importance of cultures in your success, but also the importance of maintaining high levels of employee engagement over the long term. What considerations are important for those countries who are in the midst of a more severe COVID crisis? What can they do to reduce burnout and maintain high levels of engagement as well? No, Kathy? All right.
So sorry, I can't seem to get the microphone to work.
We've got you now.
Oh, you've got me now. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maintaining engagement of staff and avoiding burnout. One of the biggest things to look at is the competency of the staff doing the testing. So you're not pressuring those to do the field or the laboratory work who aren't fully competent to do so, and being realistic with the targets and the KPIs you can set around that. So we've had really in-depth conversations with health to map out what the training of our staff looks like, and sometimes that will be months in advance of when you're actually going to be able to hit a target. And so trying to push the staff beyond that would have compromised the quality of the program. Definitely keeping communication and shared platforms with all those working together, so the field guys see how hard the sample receipt teams are working, how hard the labs are working, and providing some extra provisions for fatigue management. The lab staff are often in there till 2 a.m. in the morning, so arranging cab charges for them to go home, things that you're not putting them in undue, unsafe environments and then expecting more of them the next day. Providing light at the end of the tunnel, so having really clear strategies around resourcing, onboarding, and ongoing training, so that they can see eventually there's going to be a bigger crew to do this work. So trying to invest in that. I hope that's answered the question. Sorry for the background noise. I'm not sure where that's coming from.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Rachel, probably a related question. How do you think we could best evaluate and improve effective behaviour change communication for wastewater surveillance?
Yeah, thanks, Marlene. In terms of looking at whether we've had that effective behaviour change for a call out for a particular area, we can look at, I guess, the fixed site testing results for that particular area before and after the call out to see if there has been a change in testing numbers. Obviously, there's other factors that we need to consider, if there's been any other reasons why there might be an uptake in testing for a particular area as well. So it is a rough analysis in a sense to help inform, I guess, some of that evaluation. But we can also look at other methods to also evaluate how effective our communication is, checking if our comms are clear in what we're advising and what the call to action is as well. So there's, I think, probably a range of different methods we can look at, and it's certainly something that we've put more effort into resourcing at the moment, given, I guess, the pivot with our strategy at the moment. So.
Thanks, Rachel. We are trying to get Hui online, who is our AWA member from Vietnam. So it would be really good if we had some time to get his experience of the methods transfer from Australia to Vietnam, and maybe this might be useful for others who are trying to do the same. In the meantime, while we're trying to do that, there's another question on ragging as well. Is ragging an issue for loss of the sampler or loss of COVID signal? Volunteers for who would like to field that one? I think you'd all be able to.
Where are you going? As in sort of the diameter of the pipe that you're inserting the sampler into and those sorts of things. So you're more likely to have ragging in a smaller pipe and then issues around that.
Thanks, Alex. And so, Alex, you've delivered a lot of training for the lab method. So what are some considerations, staffing considerations for labs who are just starting up SARS-CoV-2 analysis?
What was really important for us was, we had a background in molecular microbiology. We had experience in that. We had some experienced staff. And so having people come in who actually have some background in that is helpful. It's really hard to do it if you don't have that expertise at all, to try and start that up. There were lots of discussions and things that went on, there's been constant training and constant adaptation, so it's also that ability to be agile and change to whatever direction you need to change to, because it could be that your kit's not coming in this week or your detection kit's not coming in, all these sorts of things as well. So it's been a constant adaptation, but the staff have been pretty good. So for new labs, it's around having hopefully a bit of background in PCR and detection, and then for any of the teams that we've trained, it's been a lot of discussion with them over results, review of those results, and making sure that everything's working. And if it's not, then we'll go and troubleshoot and work through that. And there's no dumb questions as well. It might be something simple in the process that's been missed, but it might be important. So it's worth having all of those questions answered.
That, Alex, absolutely. We're going to go to a break now. We will try to get Hoy on for our next panel. So if you stay with us, we'll be back shortly after the break.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to session 5. We're talking today in this session about the future research and innovation. So I will hand over to the first video, which is Aaron.
Hi everyone, I'm Aaron Jackson. Thanks very much for the invitation to present some of the work that we've been doing within our contribution to Victoria's Colossus program. I'm going to speak on some of the tools we've been developing for detection of SARS-CoV-2 variants in wastewater. Now, as I'm sure you all know by now, there are a variety of different variants of this virus that have emerged since the beginning of the pandemic in early 2019, the most known of which at the present moment, of course, is the Delta variant. These variants are classified based on the emergence of mutations in their genomes, and they're clustered into different categories based on their predominance around the world, whether they've had proven increased transmission effect or pathogenicity or vaccine escape capacity, and then ultimately whether they're no longer treatable with our current vaccine formulations. So these are termed as variants of interest, variants of concern, and variants of high consequence. And the Delta variant is presently a variant of concern. So as we look through these SNPs, we'll see that the SNPs that are really important when it comes to understanding mutations that are really important in understanding the potential for these new variants to either have increased transmission or to escape vaccine or at least antibody detection, all really sort of cluster within a particular protein called the spike protein. For those of you who don't know, the spike protein is involved directly in interaction with the ACE2 receptor on the human cells and mediates invasion. And a lot of the mutations that affect transmission are clustered within this sort of region here in kind of codon positions 400 to about 520, which overlaps with this region shown in red in this model that directly interacts with the receptor. There's another hotspot of mutations that's emerging more recently in this sort of area between codon 60 and about 100, 120, 150, which relates to regions that appear to be largely detected by a variety of antibodies that are produced either upon exposure to the virus or with various vaccine formulations that are currently being used. And these provide the potential possibly for vaccine escape. The assays that we've designed, that we've been working on, are targeting these regions, and they're looking for individual SNPs that can then be classified as being associated with specific variants. A variety of different techniques that we're using. I obviously don't have a lot of time to go into these in detail, but we've been targeting a PCR-based approach in which we amplify, particularly in the initial stages. This region is associated with increased transmissibility, where we see, for example, SNPs like T478K that are associated with Delta variant. We amplify this through a hemi-nested PCR, and then we sequence it and we look for the mutations. We've also developed a companion assay using something called the CRISPR-Sherlock technique, which uses an enzymatic reaction to identify, based on probes that have the mutation that we're looking for, PCR products that have this, the T478 mutation, produces a fluorescent reaction, and we read that in a relatively simple assay. In addition to that, we've been testing both a commercial-based qPCR as well as our own targeted PCRs. Our targeted PCR that all present on is focused on the T478K mutation. We've also been looking at droplet PCRs and a few other techniques. In terms of where the assays are at, we've developed a variety of assays in parallel for these different methods and targeting different variants. We focused the bulk of our efforts most recently on this mutation that's associated with the Delta variant for obvious reasons, but we have a number of other similar variants using similar approaches that are targeting other variants of concern. In terms of where these methods have gone, so our in-house RT-PCR seems to have the highest sensitivity. It works for most samples within the Colossus program in Victoria that are positive for SARS-CoV-2 in our 2-assay qPCR. This is the Perkin-Elmer, the Perkin-Elmer the Perkin-Elmer SARS-CoV-2 detection kit. And this seems to work quite well with those. At about a CT level sensitivity of around about CT37 or so, which is equivalent to around about 10 genomes per reaction or less than 100 viral genome copies per 250 mils. When we first started this work, that seemed a really big deal. I think at the moment we would love to have wastewater samples that have 100 virus copies in them. The spike PCR gives us a similar level of performance for dual target positive samples, where we have samples with either assay coming up with just one of the qPCR assays in our diagnostic. Neither technique works nearly as well. Those tend to have much lower levels. The hemi-nested PCR has the advantage of being able to be used for any of the known variants through amplicon sequencing, which gives us greater adaptability. It's not quite as sensitive. It probably comes in at around about 250 to 500 viral copies per mil wastewater. The Sherlock assay works well. Its only dependency is that the spike PCR is working. So provided that that's the case, then we get good results there. I'm using the T478K assay as an example. And the commercial kit, which is Perkin-Elmer's current formulation of a variant detect kit, really didn't provide the level of sensitivity that we need for these assays. Really having a limit of detection of around about a CQ of 31 or 32, so somewhere between 8 to 64-fold lower sensitivity or beyond that to what we get with our RT-PCR or the hemi-nested PCR. In summary, we developed a number of different assays that work well for viral detection or for variant detection, not least being, and probably most promisingly, being a hemi-nested PCR that can work for any variants. We've also developed targeted assays that have high sensitivity and give us rapid turnaround. In an ideal world, I think we would likely use this in a variant detection program in a twofold way, where we would have the hemi-nested PCR for broad-scale variant detection, and then targeted RT-qPCRs to give us sensitive and rapid specific diagnostics for high-priority variants. In the next steps, we've developed an extension of the spike PCR that targets this codon 60 to 170 region, where there's mutations that accumulate that might give vaccine escape. We're putting that together in a duplex PCR that seems to be working quite well now, and that allows simultaneous detection in both of these regions. In conclusion, I'd like to acknowledge this is a massive program that has a lot of contributors. It would take me more than the time I have to list all of them, but I'd like to acknowledge their contributions that have been really fantastic, not least, of course, WaterRA. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name's Joel Siegel. I'm the innovation lead in the research and development team at South East Water in Melbourne. And I just wanted to share very briefly with you about an initiative that we've just finished yesterday, which was a design sprint looking at titled Sewage Insights, looking at what might the future of wastewater-based epidemiology be in our communities. What we ran was a 3-day sprint using the human-centered design process. The human-centered design process, for those who aren't familiar, is characterized by this double diamond you can see on the screen. It's this process of diverging and converging to understand a problem statement or an opportunity space, and then again diverging as you ideate and look for potential solutions, and converging again to prototype and develop that solution. We did this very conceptually, given the subject matter, but it's done in an intensified, accelerated 3-day process. And we also ran this in parallel with another team in the UK. Northumbrian Water were the lead over there, and they brought together a group of participants of water authorities, researchers, health representatives, and you can see on the screen who we had involved here. The question we asked was, we wanted to explore how the water industry can play a greater role in wastewater-based epidemiology going forward, and in community health more broadly. Through it very briefly, component might we statements, which is trying to understand what's the opportunity or the challenge we want to go for. We explored a number of these how might we statements. For example, how might we maintain community interest in WBE post-COVID? That was a key one. How do we manage this transition from the COVID days to the post-COVID days, even if there are no post-COVID days, and keep up interest and keep up the benefits of WBE? We went through a discovery process, so speaking with a number of different people to understand their perspectives on the matter. What are the gaps? What are the challenges? And what are the opportunities? And we heard some key things, and from that tried to develop insights that could help inform a solution or a prototype that would be put forward. One that raised a bunch of people's eyebrows, you can see there, was, could we use wastewater-based epidemiology to look at protein levels from individual nursing homes and understand whether the people in those homes are being fed enough? So we tried to challenge ourselves on the extent and the breadth of WBE and how it could be used for broader community health. I unfortunately don't have the time to go into a lot of the other ideas, but the process really allowed for some quite different ideas, ideas that challenged maybe where we currently see WBE. What we put forward and what the sprint team put forward, which was comprised of a number of people here on this call as well, and I'll invite them to join for any questions, is trying to imagine what if we as the water industry actually became an enabler of healthy communities and did this in a cost-effective way. And that was a key point that came up a number of times, is that wastewater-based epidemiology is cost-effective. It allows us to move up the chain into proactive rather than reactive health. And it provides a level of data, both spatial and temporal, that you can't necessarily achieve with other methods. So the future that we imagined was a realignment of the Water Authority vision to include this aspect, this community health aspect, beyond the current things that we take as part of Water Authority's remits. The way to achieve this, is only roughly sketched out at this point. But the thinking was that we would need someone to take the lead, and Water Research Australia is really in the best position to do this and to bring the industry together, and to start working to lobby for some pretty minor changes to legislation that would allow our role in WBE to be legitimised, and also to allow cost recovery, and how that works with our customers and maintaining prices for what is at its core a water and sewage service, to build strong collaborations, to look for funding and to look for funding in ways that we haven't necessarily done it until now, where things are either piecemeal or they're done at a local or short-term level. And then the platform side of things. So that's the sampling systems, the monitoring, the IT systems, and the actual community engagement and access systems. So headline that we would love to see at the end of this is South East Water, a guardian for the health and environment for their customers and community. And that's not just South East Water, but really extends to the whole water sector. And there, I won't run through them, but a number of benefits we can see for the water industry to getting to this point. So that was a quick run through, and thanks for having me along.
Thanks, Joel. That's great summary. And if anyone's got any questions for Joel, please put them in the chat. Aaron has had to duck out to another meeting, so he won't be joining us for the Q&A, but if you do have questions, please do put them in the chat, and we can feed them over to Aaron as well and send you the response. So if anyone's got any questions for Joel, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, Joel, how do you find this human-centered design and the design sprint as a process compared to other ways of sort of innovative thinking?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a proof of concept for us at South East Water to run these design sprints. Some of the feedback we've gotten from participants has been that it's allowed them to think in a different way because of even just the structure, that it's quite an intense environment. It's many hours over several days. It does allow people the space to think in different ways. The other thing is that it's really structured. And as much as a lot of people don't like that and they want to just, attack a whiteboard with a bunch of markers or sticky notes, the structure actually forces you to look from different perspectives. The discovery process in particular really forces you to try to bring as many different voices into the room, which often we struggle to do in the research world. And what we think of as different voices are really just, similar researchers from slightly different backgrounds or slightly different, universities and things.
Thank you. And are there any insights from the UK version of the design sprint? As far as I understand, they're not yet finished, but do you have any early insights from their thoughts on WBE that you could share with the group? Or do we have to wait for those?
I wish I could. We're hanging on tight. We've had some updates as they've been going. We seem to be diverging a little bit, which we expected. This is a big space and it's, in some ways very much in its infancy. So we didn't expect to come up with the same solution as them. But yeah, we'll be hanging on to see what they come up with.
Wonderful. Great. Well, thanks for joining us, Joel. And we look forward to hear what happens soon.
Thanks, Kelly.
So I guess I'll wrap up this session, give a little thank you to everybody and some shout outs. If Hoy manages to jump in, we will ask him a quick question. Otherwise, anyone that's on the call wanting to hear some advice from Hoy about his experience in, transferring these methods and the knowledge and, the intercultural transfer and the relationships and building all the connections that has happened. Hoy's done an amazing job. So if anyone wants to learn from him, I'm absolutely sure he'll be able to provide some insights. So do write questions in the chat if you've got any for Hoy. I guess I wanted to thank a few people before we wrap up, and mostly to all the presenters, and I'm not sure you can all join me on the screen right now. I would love for you to do that. I want to thank you for your presentations today and for the fantastic work that you've been doing and that you continue to do. It really does make a difference to the whole community. I want to thank everybody that's listening in today and for your great questions and being really interactive and really engaging. It's quite hard to do these things virtually, as you've found 18 months. And engaging and really interacting has really given a wealth of extra value for our presenters who have given up their time to be with us today. I also want to thank the WaterRA CEO and Dan Beer and Marlene, for co-facilitating the symposium and all your hard work and dedication. All the people behind the scenes in the background of the symposium that have been working on the tech and making sure things are going as well as they can. We will be making online and available online. And if you have any questions that are not answered, we'll make sure that we get you some answers from our amazing speakers. And thanks again to all the Colossus partners and everybody online. It's been a pleasure working with you all and making a difference. And it's so great to see so many of you here. Thank you.